My name is Dean Murphy, and this happened to me in September 2010. I worked as a backcountry ranger in Glacier National Park, Montana. My name is Dean Murphy, and this happened to me in September 2010. I worked as a backcountry ranger in Glacier National Park, Montana. It's about as wild and rugged a place as you can find in the lower 48. I'd seen my share of grizzlies and mountain lions over the years, but those encounters were straightforward and predictable. What I faced back then had no guidebook. The call came in on a crisp autumn morning. A group of hikers reported a missing friend just off an unmarked trail near one of the park's many glacial lakes. My partner Amelia and I grabbed our gear and headed out, assuming it was a case of a couple of greenhorns who were out of their depth. We reached the trailhead around midday. The group was there, frantic and shaken. They didn't describe getting lost, but told a story of something entirely different. They swore their friend had been snatched and dragged off into the underbrush so quickly that none of them got a clear look at what took him. Amelia and I exchanged had been snatched and dragged off. The area was known to bear territory, yes, but a brazen daylight abduction didn't fit the usual pattern. Still, duty called. I loaded my rifle and chambered around as we began following their tracks. The forest here was ancient, with a dense canopy creating an almost perpetual twilight. We found the spot a short distance off the trail. Signs of a struggle were unmistakable. Trampled brush, scuff marks on the soft ground, and drops of blood staining the vibrant fallen leaves. I signaled to Amelia, and we advanced with weapons drawn, senses on high alert. Then I saw a flash of movement just ahead, half veiled by foliage. My heart pounded. I motioned for Amelia to flank right as I cautiously moved forward. It wasn't there. It was far too tall, its limbs impossibly long and skeletal. And those eyes, they glowed a malevolent green in the blue. The creature crouched low, observing us, then vanished into the trees with unnerving speed. I swore under my breath. We radioed HQ, our voices tense as we described the situation. Our supervisor sounded skeptical, but backup was dispatched. We decided to track it. My name is Dean Murphy, and this happened to me in September 2010. I worked as a backcountry ranger in Glacier National Park, Montana. It's about as wild and rugged a place as you can find in the lower 48. I'd seen my share of grizzlies and mountain lions over the years, but those encounters were straightforward and predictable. What I faced back then had no guidebook. The call came in on a crisp autumn morning. A group of hikers reported a missing friend just off an unmarked trail near one of the park's many glacial lakes. My partner Amelia and I grabbed our gear and headed out, assuming it was a case of a couple of greenhorns who were out of their depth. We reached the trailhead around midday. The group was there, frantic and shaken. They didn't describe getting lost, but told a story of something entirely different. They swore their friend had been snatched and dragged off into the underbrush so quickly that none of them got a clear look at what took him. Amelia and I exchanged worried glances. The area was known bear territory, yes, but a brazen daylight abduction didn't fit the usual pattern. Still, duty called. I loaded my rifle and chambered around as we began following their tracks. The forest here was ancient, with a dense canopy creating an almost perpetual twilight. We found the spot a short distance off the trail. Signs of a struggle were unmistakable. Trampled brush, scuff marks on the soft ground, and drops of blood staining the vibrant fallen leaves. I signaled to Amelia, and we advanced with weapons drawn, senses on high alert. Then I saw a flash of movement just ahead, half veiled by the foliage. My heart pounded. I motioned for Amelia to flank right as I cautiously moved forward. It wasn't a bear. It was far too tall, its limbs impossibly long and skeletal. And those eyes, they glowed a malevolent green in the gloom. The creature crouched low, observing us, then vanished into the trees with unnerving speed. I swore under my breath. We radioed HQ, our voices tense as we described the situation. Our supervisor sounded skeptical, but backup was dispatched. We decided to track it, maybe scare it off, maybe find any trace of our missing hiker, alive or otherwise. The creature left subtle signs like a predator toying with its prey, broken branches, the occasional smear of blood on a tree trunk. Not the victim's blood, but something else. The deeper we ventured, the more unnerved I became. It was as if we were the ones being hunted. Amelia must have felt it too, because her usual easygoing banter had dwindled. The sun began its descent, casting long shadows through the trees. That's when we found the clearing. In its center were the grisly remains of a deer, stripped almost to the bone. Surrounding it in a crude circle were more animal carcasses, a fox, a mountain goat, mutilated and torn. It was either an offering or a warning. I looked up and saw the creature perched on a boulder, overlooking the gruesome scene. Its sinewy form was stark against the twilight, its green eyes blazing. Suddenly, the creature screeched, loud enough to make the birds scatter from the trees, and charged. Amelia and I barely had time to raise our rifles and fire. The shots connected, but the creature seemed more enraged than injured. It lunged at Amelia, swiping with claws that looked as long as knives. She scrambled back, tripped, and I saw the moment she thought she was dead. I fired again, the muzzle flash cutting through the deepening gloom. This time, the creature let out an ear-splitting shriek of pain and staggered back. I yelled for Amelia to get up, and together we retreated, firing to keep the creature at bay. It trailed us for a heart-stopping eternity, its shrieks echoing through the forest. We finally staggered onto a logging road, reuniting with backup under the harsh glare of vehicle headlights. The official explanation was a rogue bear, of course, but every night when I close my eyes, I see that unnatural shape bounding through the trees, those glowing green eyes. The missing hiker was never found, no trace of him. Folks think Amelia and I hyped up our encounter, either out of panic or to land a juicy story. I don't care. Deep down, I know what's out there, lurking in those ancient forests. And I know, even though folks call me crazy, that it's only a matter of time until it strikes again. I stayed on as a ranger for a few more years, a stubborn knot of defiance twisting in my gut until I finally burned out. I moved south, found work as a wildlife guide, safer mostly. Sometimes, late at night, I watch the edge of the woods near my cabin. I see shadows that seem to twist and elongate unnaturally, and I hear the rustle of leaves where the wind shouldn't reach. I wonder, does it remember me, the ranger who fought back? Does it wait, its patience as inhuman as its grotesque form, or has it moved on to easier prey? I keep a rifle nearby just in case. I started to wonder if I had stumbled into some crazy hunter's territory, or maybe a poacher's hideout. But the more I thought about it, the less it made sense. No traps, no bait stations, Nothing that fit the profile of some old hermit. That's when it hit me. Those stories you hear whispered around campfires about things that aren't supposed to exist. Sasquatch nonsense, all tall tales and bad campfire whiskey. Yet every hair on my body was screaming I wasn't alone out there, and whatever it was wanted me, my kill, or maybe both. I kept watch with my rifle ready. Nights were the worst. Whatever it was clawed at the blind, scraping on the canvas. Once, I swear, something hand-like tried to push under the flap. I almost filled my pants, but I leveled the gun and fired a warning shot into the night, which sent whatever it was scattering. But it came back, hungrier, angrier, starting to circle tighter and shaking the whole damn blind. I figured it was time to act or become critter food. I slipped on my boots as quietly as I could, grabbed my knife and prepared to make my stand. Out here, it ain't just about hunting. It's about staying alive. I wasn't about to become its dinner without a fight. I counted my bullets, checked the blade. I'm not the praying type, but I might have muttered a quick one. Holding my breath, I ripped open the blind and burst into the trees. I didn't stop to think, just ran. Branches whipped my face, pine needles cut my arms, but the pain only made me go faster. I could hear it lumbering behind me, crashing through the woods with a force that shook the ground. My breath burned in my chest, my legs ached, but I didn't look back. It was either run or be caught by whatever the hell was out there. Finally, I tripped over a root and went sprawling into the dirt. I scrambled up, expecting to feel claws sink into me, but there was nothing. Just silence, save for my ragged breathing. Had I outrun it? Doubtful. More likely it was toying with me like a cat with a mouse. I crouched, trying to listen past the blood pounding in my ears. Then from off to the right came a crack of a branch, and that stench, Lord, that awful stench. It was circling me again. I took off, dodging trees and scrambling through the brush. I had a flash of that doe I'd shot, the carcass hanging untouched by the blind. The thing probably had its fill and was now after live bait, me. My legs were giving out, my lungs screamed, but then I saw it. A sliver of light through the trees. The road. I must have been closer than I thought. With lungs on fire, I sprinted, pushing harder than I ever had in my life. I broke out of the woods right onto the gravel shoulder. I didn't even look back, just ran. I heard a roar like thunder behind me, the heavy thumping of its footfalls. Almost there. Almost to safety. Then the ground disappeared beneath me. I tumbled down an embankment and landed hard on my back, the breath knocked out of me. I tried to scramble up, but my ankle throbbed like fire. Damn twig must have snapped it. Now I was trapped. I rolled and looked up. It was there, crouched at the edge of the embankment, a hulking shape shadowed in the starlight. The only thing clear was that rotten meat smell. I could hear it snort, heavy breaths almost like laughter. It started down the slope, moving slowly, like it knew it had me. I had no gun, no knife, and a useless leg. It got closer and closer. I squeezed my eyes shut, not wanting to see the teeth that would rip into me. But it didn't come. I opened my eyes a crack. The creature was stopped just a few feet away, standing up and towering over me now, fur matted with blood, claws as long as knives, and the most unsettling thing, it almost looked human. Not quite, but more than an animal should. A low growl built in its throat. Was this it? My end? Then I heard voices shouting, men with flashlights cutting through the trees. They must have heard the commotion. The creature hesitated, then turned and bolted back into the woods, disappearing like a ghost. I lay there, blinking, barely daring to breathe. When those men reached me, all I could manage to say was, "There's something out there, something big." They didn't believe me at first, thought I was spooked by a bear or worse, had cracked on my own. They called for backup, a forest ranger, maybe even a cop. They took them back to the blind, to the carcass, showed them the clawed-up tent. That got their attention. The ranger recognized the tracks didn't belong to any animal they knew. The cops dusted everything for prints, but only found mine and tracks from that thing, massive, misshapen, and not matching any records. They took me back to the station, filled out reports, gave statements. I stuck to the story, even as their eyes told me they thought I was a lunatic. It wasn't until a few hours later, when an old deputy came to question me, that things changed. He sat down and looked me square in the eye. "Son," he said, "I might be old, but I'm not foolish. There are things in these woods your fancy science won't explain. Your grandpappy ever tell you stories about Sasquatch? Damn it all if he hadn't. When I was a kid, Grandpa would sit me down by the fire and spin yarns taller than he was about run-ins with mountain giants. I never thought a word of it was true." The deputy nodded. "There have been whispers about them since folks first settled this land. Sightings every few years, disappearances that no one can make sense of. We brush it off, but..." He trailed off, then looked at me hard. "I believe you, son, and that makes this a whole lot more dangerous." It turned out this wasn't just about me anymore. If that thing had attacked once, it could attack again. The whole town was at risk. We rallied a search party. Rangers, hunters, anyone with a gun and half a lick of backwoods sense. We spent the next few days scouring the woods, but found nothing but more tracks leading deep into the Stannis, past where anyone dared to go. Folks were spooked. News traveled, drawing in outsiders, cryptid hunters, and reporters with cameras, all hungry for a story. It turned my quiet little life into a damn circus. We never did catch the creature. As far as I know, it's still out there. But that isn't the end of the tale. After a while, the fuss died down, the news folks left, and the monster chasers got bored. But I couldn't shake it. I couldn't sleep without seeing those clawed hands, smelling that rot. And then there were the others, the disappeared hikers, the hunters found half-eaten. Turns out I wasn't the only one who'd crossed paths with that thing and lived. I started getting calls and letters, a woman from Washington, a fisherman from Montana, each with their own tale of a close encounter or narrow escape. Seems I wasn't alone after all. And maybe, just maybe, there's a reason those of us it touched survived, a reason the creature, the Bigfoot, keeps letting some of us slip through its claws. I don't know the answer, but I aim to find out. I always say the best deer stands are the ones where folks leave you alone. Sure, you haul your gear miles in and might sweat a bit getting set up, but come season you've got the backwoods to yourself, except for a few critters that are smart enough to keep their distance. That kind of quiet is worth more than gold. I've been hunting since I could hold my old man's rifle. I know the land, know the animals, and have learned to find game trails, follow tracks, and pick a safe perch. Hell, I've even learned to walk so softly that sparrows don't notice me coming. Most folks call it respect for nature. I call it being practical. This year I dug in deep, real deep. I ventured off the well-trodden trails into a slice of the Stannis forest that isn't even marked on fancy compasses. I arrived by foot with my tent on my back and found a good patch of ground with a clear view. I set up the blind, nothing luxurious but sturdy enough. The first few days were perfect. The air was crisp, the sky so clear that the stars seemed close enough to grab. I even bagged a doe the second morning with a clean shot. It made me wish I had the old truck running to haul it, but I had learned to manage. That night, things took a turn for the strange. It's hard to pinpoint exactly what it was. A sound, maybe. Branches snapping further out than a deer should make, or perhaps the hairs on my neck standing up. I remember thinking, damn coyotes, always bold this time of year. But something felt off. It wasn't just the sound, it was the sensation of being watched. Not by your average animal, but by something too big and too smart. It felt like something had been tracking me the whole way out here. Over the next few days, I caught glimpses of movement at the edge of the trees, way bigger than any deer or bear I'd ever seen. At night, I'd hear rustling around the tent, almost like footsteps, heavy thumping that shook the ground. The worst was the smell, like a wet dog, but 1,000 times worse, rotten with something that should stay buried deep in the woods. It made me gag just thinking about it. This happened to me in 1963. I'm Eden MacArthur, a park ranger for the past 10 years. I've always loved the outdoors, the quiet, the solitude. It's in my blood, I guess. My grandpappy was a mountain man, or so the stories go. It all started with a missing hiker, which wasn't unusual. People get lost in the vastness of the park all the time. But this one was different. David, a young college student, judging by the gear he left behind. His tent was neat, his backpack organized, and there was even a half-eaten bag of trail mix sitting on a rock. No signs of struggle, just gone. The sheriff called me up, said the family was frantic, and wanted to organize a search to see if we could find the kid. I gathered a few volunteers, good men used to the terrain. We scoured the valley for 2 days with no luck. We found some footprints leading into a dense part of the woods, but they just stopped, like the earth had swallowed him whole. On the 3rd day, I was on my own. The volunteers had other things to do, families, jobs. I couldn't let it go, though. Something felt off, prickling at the back of my neck. I kept thinking about those footprints vanishing into thin air. As the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the valley, I saw it. A shape dark against the dying light, moving through the trees. It was too big to be a bear, too fluid to be a deer. Curiosity, or maybe stupidity, got the better of me, so I followed it. The woods were dense here, with sunlight barely penetrating the canopy. The air was thick with the smell of pine needles and damp earth. The shape moved silently, like a whisper in the wind. I kept my distance, my hand hovering over the rifle strapped across my back. Then I saw it clearly. It was humanoid, but not human. Tall, easily 7 feet, with long, lanky limbs. Its skin was a mottled gray, almost blending into the shadows. It moved with an unsettling grace, its head cocked to the side as if listening to the forest. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. This wasn't some lost hiker. This was something else entirely, something primal, something terrifying. I backed away slowly, my eyes never leaving the creature. It turned its head, and I swear it looked right at me. Its eyes were black, empty like bottomless pits. I felt a jolt of pure fear run through me, cold and sharp. I ran, crashing through the undergrowth, the creature's gaze burning into my back. I didn't stop until I reached my cabin, a small ramshackle thing tucked away on the edge of the park. My hands were shaking, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I slammed the door shut, bolted it, and leaned against the rough wood, my heart pounding against my ribs. I couldn't sleep that night. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of leaves outside sent shivers down my spine. The image of the creature, its blank eyes and unsettling grace, was seared into my mind. The next day, I went back to the spot where I'd seen it. There were tracks unlike anything I'd ever seen before, long, narrow footprints with 3 toes. They led deeper into the woods, towards the most remote and inaccessible part of the park. I reported it to the sheriff, told him about the creature and the tracks. He listened patiently, his face unreadable. Then he said, "Eden, you know there are bears in these woods. Big ones." I tried to explain, to tell him this wasn't any bear, but the words wouldn't come out right. I sounded like a crazy old man ranting about monsters in the woods. The sheriff patted my shoulder, gave me a look that was a mixture of pity and concern. "Get some rest, Eden," he said. You've been through a lot." I knew he didn't believe me, but I couldn't let it go. Something was out there, something that had taken the hiker, something that had watched me from the shadows. I had to find out what it was. Days turned into weeks, and the fear turned into a gnawing obsession. I studied animal tracks, read every book I could find on local legends, anything that could shed light on what I'd seen. One day, while sifting through old newspaper clippings at the library, I found something, an article from the 1920s with a blurry photograph of a footprint eerily similar to the ones I'd seen. The article spoke of strange sightings, unexplained disappearances, and whispers of a creature lurking in the shadows. I showed it to the sheriff. This time, he didn't dismiss me outright. He studied the article, his brow furrowed. "This is interesting, Eden," he said slowly. "I'll make some inquiries." He kept his word. A few days later, he called me, his voice grave. It turns out there had been similar reports going back decades. Nothing concrete, mostly hearsay and rumors, but enough to warrant a closer look. He had contacted the Park Service and requested additional resources. A team of rangers arrived from out of state, men and women with years of experience tracking wildlife. They brought with them equipment, cameras, motion detectors. This wasn't a search and rescue anymore. It was an investigation. We set traps, placed cameras, and covered miles of terrain. Weeks went by, and the tension in the air grew thicker. The other rangers, initially skeptical, started to share my unease. The woods felt different, heavier, as if something was watching us from the shadows. Then, one night, it happened. One of the cameras deep in the woods caught something, a fleeting glimpse, a blur of movement in the darkness. But it was enough. It was the creature, its long limbs and hunched back, unmistakable. The next morning, we found one of the rangers, Sarah, her name was, lying dead by the stream. Her body was mangled, twisted at an unnatural angle, her eyes wide with terror. It was a sight that would stay with me forever, a testament to the raw, primal savagery of the thing we were dealing with. The news spread like wildfire. Fear gripped the valley, tourists fled, and the park was closed indefinitely. The search for the creature intensified, but it was like chasing a ghost. It left no trace, only a chilling silence in its wake. We never caught it, never even got a clear shot of it. The search was eventually called off, resources reallocated, and the park reopened, albeit with a heavy sense of unease hanging over it. Years have passed and the memories haven't faded. I still walk those woods, but I always keep my eyes open, my senses alert. The creature is out there somewhere, a shadow lurking in the deepest corners of the park. I don't know what it is, where it came from, or what it wants, but I know it's real. I saw it, and Sarah paid the price for our ignorance. The sheriff believed me in the end. Sarah's death was proof enough. We never found the hiker, David. Sometimes, late at night, I think I hear it moving through the trees, a whisper in the darkness, and I wonder if it's watching me, its black eyes boring into my soul, waiting for its next chance. The smoke from my Marlboro snaked through the crisp night air, the only warmth in the November chill. My name's Silas Barnett, and I used to be a reporter. I know, it's ironic, a journalist hiding away from the world. But after the election, with the whole Trump versus Biden circus, the truth became just another casualty. It was 2020, and the world felt like it was hanging by a thread. I took refuge in a secluded cabin in the Allegheny Mountains of West Virginia. My only companions were the rustling trees, the hooting owls, and the occasional black bear rummaging through my trash. It was a solitary life, but it beat the chaos of the city. Days melted into nights marked by the rising and setting sun, the brewing of coffee, and the crackling fire in the hearth. I'd hike the trails, fish in the nearby stream, and sometimes just sit on the porch watching the clouds drift across the vast expanse of the sky. One night, a thick fog rolled in, blanketing the mountains in an eerie silence. The only sound was the steady drip of water from the eaves. I settled in with a bottle of whiskey and a tattered copy of Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises. A sudden crash from outside startled me. I grabbed my old Smith & Wesson revolver and cautiously peered out the window. Nothing, just the fog swirling around the porch. I chalked it up to a falling branch or maybe a deer spooked by the weather. But then it happened again. A louder crash this time, followed by a guttural growl that sent shivers down my spine. I reached for the phone to call the sheriff, but the line was dead. Of course it was. Grasping the revolver, I crept towards the door, the floorboards creaking beneath my weight. With a deep breath, I flung it open. The beam of my flashlight cut through the fog, and two glowing eyes stared back at me. They were set in a face that was vaguely human but distorted, as if sculpted from wet clay and left to harden in the cold. The creature was tall and lanky, with skin like tree bark and limbs that seemed too long for its body. It stood motionless, its eyes fixed on mine. I fumbled for the light switch, illuminating the porch. The creature recoiled from the sudden brightness, its eyes narrowing. I got a better look. Its fingers were elongated, tipped with wickedly sharp claws, and its mouth was a gaping maw filled with jagged teeth. Terror seized me, but I raised the revolver and fired. The creature shrieked, a sound that pierced the night like a banshee's wail. It lunged at me, its claws outstretched. I dodged and fired again, but the creature was quick, its movements unnatural and erratic. It slammed into me, knocking me off the porch and into the mud. I struggled to regain my footing, the revolver slipping from my grasp. The creature loomed over me, its breath hot and fetid against my face. I kicked out, catching it in the chest and sending it sprawling backward. Scrambling to my feet, I retrieved the revolver and fired again. The creature howled in pain and retreated into the fog, leaving me shaking and covered in mud. I stumbled back into the cabin and barricaded the door with furniture. The rest of the night was a sleepless vigil, the silence punctuated by occasional growls or the snapping of a twig outside. Dawn brought weak sunlight that did little to dispel the shadows. I ventured outside cautiously, the revolver clutched in my hand. The fog had lifted, revealing the damage from the night before. The porch railing was splintered, and there were deep gouges in the wood where the creature's claws had raked. I followed the trail of blood into the woods. It led me to a clearing where I found a pile of bones, picked clean and scattered among the fallen leaves. Local folklore spoke of a creature they called the Ghoul of the Allegheny, a cannibalistic spirit that preyed on those who ventured into the mountains alone. I had dismissed it as mere superstition, a ghost story to scare children. But now I wasn't so sure. I spent the next few days holed up in the cabin, the curtains drawn and the doors locked. I listened to the radio for news of missing hikers or hunters, but there was nothing. It was as if the creature had vanished without a trace. One morning, I woke to the sound of a car pulling up outside. It was Sheriff Brody, a burly man with a thick Appalachian accent. He'd come to check on me after I'd reported the phone line being down. I told him about the creature, the attack, the bones, and the clearing. He listened patiently, a skeptical look on his face. "Sounds like you had yourself a run-in with a bear, Mr. Barnett," he said, a hint of amusement in his voice. "They can get pretty ornery this time of year." I wanted to believe him, to dismiss it all as a bear attack, but deep down I knew it was something else, something far more sinister. Brody left, promising to send someone out to fix the phone line. I watched him drive away, a wave of loneliness washing over me. I was alone again, alone with the creature lurking in the shadows. That night, I dreamt of the ghoul. It was standing over me, its claws dripping with blood, its eyes burning with a hunger that chilled me to the bone. I woke in a cold sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. I got out of bed and went to the window. The full moon cast a pale light on the mountains. I stared out into the darkness, a sense of dread gnawing at my gut. Suddenly, a shadow moved in the distance. It was tall and gaunt, its movements jerky and unnatural. The ghoul was back. I grabbed my revolver and ran outside, the cold air stinging my lungs. The ghoul was moving towards the cabin, its eyes fixed on the window. I raised the revolver and fired. The shot echoed through the valley, shattering the silence. The ghoul turned, its eyes blazing with fury. I fired again, the bullet striking its shoulder. The creature roared in pain and charged, its claws outstretched. I dodged and fired again, this time hitting it in the chest. The ghoul stumbled but kept coming. I emptied the revolver into its twisted body, the gunshots echoing through the night. The ghoul finally collapsed, its limbs twitching as it lay dying in the moonlight. The sun was just beginning to rise when I finished burying the creature. I dug a deep hole far from the cabin and covered it with rocks and branches. I didn't want any trace of it left behind. I never told anyone what really happened that night. The sheriff returned a few days later with a repairman, and I told them the bear had come back and I'd scared it off with gunshots. They believed me, or at least pretended to, but I knew the truth. I knew the ghoul was real, a creature born of darkness and despair, and I knew I had been lucky to survive its wrath. I stayed in the cabin for a few more months. The silence was now a comfort rather than a curse. I hiked the trails, fished in the stream, and watched the seasons change. But I never forgot the ghoul of the Allegheny, the creature that lurked in the shadows, waiting for its next victim. As I finally boarded the bus back to Baltimore, I couldn't help but wonder if it was still out there, watching, waiting. The truth, like the creature itself, remained a mystery. But one thing was certain. I would never forget the terror of that night, the encounter with the ghoul that changed my life forever. The year was 2019, and I was finally exploring the Pacific Northwest on a solo multi-week trek. I had wanted to do this ever since I first read Wild years ago. I've always loved the rugged coastline and the vast, old-growth forests up here. My name's Rhett Hansen, by the way, and I've been a serious hiker for a long time. I started in Oregon on the Pacific Crest Trail, and by the time I reached the Columbia River Gorge, I was feeling good and ready to head further north. I decided to spend a couple of days exploring the Washington side of the gorge. It's one of those stunning river valleys with thick forests and waterfalls cascading down sheer cliffs. I based myself out of a small town and chose to tackle one of the less frequented trails nearby. It promised waterfalls and views I knew I didn't want to miss. I set off early, excited to hit the trail after a few days off. It was even more beautiful than I'd imagined. Lush, vibrant greens everywhere, ferns as tall as trees, and the roar of waterfalls echoing all around. I took my time, stopping to admire the view at several overlooks and treating myself to a leisurely lunch on a moss-covered boulder, just soaking in the tranquility of the place. I was having the perfect day until late afternoon, when the trail took a hard turn into a section of forest that looked much denser, almost primal. The sun barely penetrated the thick canopy overhead, and the air felt cooler and somehow heavier. It wasn't spooky per se, just different. Now, I'm not usually one for superstition, but it was hard not to think of the old native legends about these forests being sacred, even guarded. Still, after a moment's hesitation, I decided to press on. The trail was clear, and I figured the density of the trees probably meant fewer crowds. As I went deeper, the silence became unsettling, not even a hint of birdsong or the chirp of insects. I started noticing strange things, trees that looked almost twisted, as if the branches were reaching out. A few times I thought I heard rustling in the foliage, but whenever I looked around, I saw nothing. I brushed it off as nerves and pushed onward, not wanting to turn back. After about half a mile, the trail led to a clearing, and in the center was a huge tree that dwarfed the others. It had a massive trunk and thick, exposed roots. I was admiring its age and power when I saw something carved into the bark at eye level. It wasn't letters, but a symbol of some kind I'd never seen before. 3 short diagonal lines crossed by a circle. I reached out to touch it, and that must have been a trigger of some sort, because, just as my fingers grazed the wood, an ear-splitting shriek erupted from high up in the branches above. I jumped and jerked back, my heart pounding through my chest. I looked up, scanning for the source of the sound, but saw nothing. My whole body was on high alert. I scanned the forest around me, and then something dropped from a massive branch in front of me. A deer carcass, still steaming and bloody. The impact when it hit the ground made me wince. I stared up in bewildered terror, and this time I saw it. A hulking shape perched on a high branch, blending perfectly with the shadows. At first, I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. All I could process was that the form was huge, vaguely man-like, but covered in thick, dark fur. Powerful muscles rippled as it clung easily to the branch. It took a few seconds for my brain to catch up with my eyes, and then it clicked. Bigfoot. My rational mind scoffed. Bigfoot wasn't real, and yet here it was, peering down at me with glowing amber eyes. I froze in place. It was almost close enough to touch. The smell hit me, musky and putrid. It tilted its head, studying me, and I heard a wet, guttural growl come from its throat. Panic finally jolted me into motion. Without even thinking, I turned and ran, shoving past the carcass and blindly back down the trail. I ran without stopping, without looking back, just propelled by adrenaline and the primal instinct to survive. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like jelly. Still, I ran. Finally, exhausted, I tripped over a root and went sprawling on the trail. I gasped, trying to suck in lungfuls of air to continue, but before I could move, a huge clawed hand landed next to my head. I squeezed my eyes shut, certain my end was near. Instead of dragging me off, though, I heard a startled grunt, some crashing through the undergrowth, and then silence. My eyes flew open. Nothing. Cautiously, I sat up. The sun was setting, casting long shadows. I didn't take a chance on seeing what was out there. I scrambled to my feet and ran until I burst out of the forest and back onto the well-traveled trail leading toward the overlook. I never looked back. I kept moving, stumbling in the gathering darkness. Long after I'd reached the safety of the main trailhead, my heart pounded in my chest. I don't think I took a normal breath the entire time. I struggled back into town in the dead of night. I somehow convinced a kind hotel clerk to let me in, and I collapsed into the room, locking the door and shoving every chair in the place against it as barricades. I stayed locked in that hotel room for 2 days, only venturing out for necessities. My mind was on overdrive, my rational side assuring me that I'd hallucinated, that no such thing as Bigfoot existed. Maybe I was too tired, the lighting was weird, or my imagination was playing tricks. But then there was the other side, the side that remembered the glowing eyes, the rancid smell, the way it had toyed with me like a cat with a mouse. It was more than a bad dream. There was something real in those woods. On the 3rd morning, I finally managed to shake myself out of my terror-induced paralysis. I booked a flight back home and was on a plane that afternoon. When I landed, I didn't even hesitate. I got a rental car and drove directly to my childhood home, where my mom still lives. I was a grown man, but I needed her comfort, her reassurance that the world wasn't as scary as it now seemed. It was late when I pulled into the driveway. Mom came to the door, her eyes widening with shock and then concern as she took in my appearance. After the first hug and a mug of steaming tea, I spilled everything, holding nothing back. Mom listened patiently without interrupting. When I was done, when the story was out there and I was shivering even in the warm kitchen, she got up and went into the living room. I followed her, wondering what she was doing. She came back with an old worn photo album and flipped to a faded black and white photo of a group of people smiling around a campfire in some forest. Grandpa and Grandma's backpacking trip with their hiking club, she said. Late 60s, somewhere in northern Washington. She pointed at a couple standing at the edge of the photo, my grandparents looking much younger. "Look at the tree," she said softly. My breath caught in my throat. Carved into the bark was the same symbol, 3 diagonal lines crossed by a circle. The same symbol I'd seen days ago in the Columbia River Gorge, hundreds of miles away. A chill ran through my body that had nothing to do with the cool night air. My dad always said those woods weren't just any woods, she told me. They were different. He never said much more about it, always just a bit of a warning. I stared at the photo, my mind trying and failing to process. Was this family lore? A coincidence? But then why had the creature come after me? Why the fresh kill? What if this wasn't a coincidence at all? In the days that followed, I did extensive research online. Bigfoot sightings in the Pacific Northwest, Native American legends about forest guardians. The more I searched, the more I saw patterns that chilled me. Strange carcasses, disappearances, sightings just like mine. There was no concrete evidence for what was out there, but it was hard to believe these were all mere hallucinations or misidentifications. I never went back to Washington. That trip soured the Pacific Northwest for me for good. I don't tell many people about it. Most think I'm crazy or pulling their leg. Mom believed me, though. She saw the look in my eyes, that raw, visceral fear that couldn't be faked. And she knew the family stories, so we have a pact of silence on this one. I still hike, but now it's always on well-trodden paths with lots of fellow hikers around. The wild feels less inviting than it used to. Part of me wants to go back, find that clearing, get some proof to bring back. But the stronger part, the part that remembers the dripping carcass and those glowing eyes, wins. Because as much as I want proof that I'm not crazy, do I really want to know what else is out there? My name is Killian Forrester, and what I'm about to share happened to me in October 2011, in a place I knew like the back of my hand, Redwood National and State Parks in California. I had worked there as a ranger for 8 years, and many considered me a veteran of the park. The job was demanding, but it got into your blood. I had no intention of quitting anytime soon. I loved hiking, camping, and especially the solitude of being in the woods, the crisp air, towering trees, and the sound of the creek. It was paradise for me. That day started like any other. I laced up my boots, grabbed my gear, and headed out on my usual patrol route. It was a clear autumn morning, with the first leaves painting the forest floor in golds and reds. I hadn't been on the trail long when I noticed something was off. Usually, the forest was filled with the sounds of birds, squirrels chattering, and the rustling of small creatures in the undergrowth. But today, it was eerily quiet. I felt uneasy, as though something was watching me. As the day went on, the feeling grew stronger. Then I stumbled upon something that my mind struggled to process: a deer carcass torn open and half devoured. But it wasn't the kill itself that chilled me. It was how the carcass was suspended from the branches of a tree, at a height no predator I knew could reach. Approaching to examine it, a wave of nausea hit me. The slashes on the animal were precise, almost surgical, as if something methodical had done it. "What the hell are you?" I muttered to myself. I had seen mountain lions, bears, everything the forest housed, But this was different. I scanned the surrounding trees, my heart pounding. Suddenly, I caught a flicker of movement. Then I saw them, glowing eyes staring down at me. They were almost human, but far too large. What I saw in the treetops was enormous, far bigger than any person, with unnaturally long, thin limbs. Its skin was dark and textured like rough bark. The creature tilted its head at an unnatural angle, and then, in the blink of an eye, it was gone, vanished into the canopy. Panicked, I radioed for backup, stammering out a bewildered description of the creature. Ranger Dispatch sounded amused, probably thinking I'd finally cracked under the strain. But then my partner, Alara, shouted over the radio, her voice filled with panic. "Killian, I found something. You need to get here fast. It's bad, really bad." A sickening dread filled me. When I reached her, what I saw made me question my sanity. A hiker lay on the ground, his body twisted at impossible angles. The same calculated marks I'd seen on the deer were on him, a kind of brutal precision that made me want to vomit. Before I could process the horror, a scream tore through the trees. I ran toward the sound, with Alara following close behind. Branches whipped at my face and roots snagged my feet, but fear drove me forward. We reached a clearing and my blood ran cold. Alara was trapped. The creature had pinned her to the ground, one massive hand covering her mouth, the other hovering near her throat. Its long claws glinted in the dappled sunlight. Its eyes burned with an intelligence that was both eerie and terrifying. We locked eyes for a frozen moment, and I swear it seemed to pause, as if reading my intentions. Then, with shocking speed, it grabbed Alara and disappeared into the dense foliage. I collapsed to my knees, a strangled sob escaping my throat. My mind raced. Was this some freak of nature, an undiscovered species, or something more sinister? Whatever it was, I knew no animal or human could have done this. The woods that had once been my sanctuary were now a nightmare, and whatever lurked in those trees had broken something deep inside me. I knew I wasn't safe anymore, and neither was anyone else. When backup finally arrived, I must have looked like a madman, babbling about monsters and eyes in the trees. They sedated me. When I woke up, they were chalking it up to stress, maybe even a bear attack. Alara's body was never found, despite an extensive search. No trace of her or the creature was ever recovered, leaving an open wound in our close-knit ranger community. I resigned from my position a few weeks later. I tried to explain what I had seen, but my words felt hollow, even to myself. The incident haunted me, the carnage, Alara's terrified eyes, and the creature's eerie intelligence. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't just prey, I was being studied, hunted. The experience tore me away from the wilderness I once loved, leaving me with a fear I couldn't shake. I'm sharing this now not for sympathy or validation, and frankly, I don't expect anyone to believe me. But I can't stay silent any longer. There's something inhuman in those woods, and it will strike again. It's only a matter of time. Over the next decade, I couldn't settle down. I moved from one anonymous city to the next, paranoia gnawing at me. Therapy, support groups, medication. Nothing could banish the memory of those glowing eyes or the sense of being watched. I became a shadow of my former self, driven by a constant irrational dread. Then the reports started. At first, they were just whispers among park rangers in Oregon and Washington, disappearances, animal mutilations, bearing the same methodical marks I had seen. My heart pounded. It was back. No one else connected the dots, but I did. The incidents were treated as isolated tragedies, freak accidents. But I knew better. I felt sick with guilt and helplessness. I tried to warn others, but my frantic stories only solidified my reputation as unhinged. One night, an old colleague, Simon, reached out. We hadn't spoken since the Redwood incident. His voice was grim. "Killian, people are dying out here. Rangers, hikers. It's just like you said." You need to come back." With heavy reluctance, I found myself on a backcountry trail in Washington's Olympic National Park. Simon, visibly shaken, filled me in. 3 hikers had vanished and 2 rangers were found brutally murdered, their bodies marked with the same terrifying wounds. We set out on the hunt, moving through the ancient forest, our senses on high alert. Simon, who once doubted me, had come to accept the terrifying truth. Days into the wilderness, the dread became almost unbearable. Then we saw it, a hulking silhouette flickering in the moonlight. We exchanged a terrified glance and took off in pursuit. The creature was impossibly fast, its long limbs propelling it through the dense undergrowth. It led us deeper into the forest, to a hidden clearing. In the center of the clearing stood a massive tree. At its base were remnants, clothing, backpacks, bones, all stained with dried blood. My stomach churned. This was its lair. A low growl broke the silence and the creature stepped into view. This time I saw it clearly, all 7 feet of it, with impossibly long claws and dark, leathery skin. But it was the eyes that froze me in place, glowing pools of malevolence. Fear and fury surged within me. Desperation to avenge Alara and the others drove me forward. Simon and I raised our rifles and fired, the shots echoing through the clearing. The creature roared but didn't falter. It charged, a blur of limbs and claws. We fired again and again, but the creature barely stumbled. Then Simon screamed. It had him. The creature dragged him toward the tree with terrifying speed. I ran to his side, but it was too late. With a sickening crunch, it snapped Simon's leg like a twig. His screams cut through the night. I was next. The creature grabbed me, its massive hand closing around my torso. Pain exploded through my ribs as it lifted me off the ground. Its rancid breath washed over me, and I stared into its fathomless eyes. The last thing I saw was its claw moving toward me before everything went black. I woke up in a hospital, battered but alive. The official report called it a rogue bear attack, but the look in the doctor's eyes told me he didn't believe it either. The story made headlines, stirring fascination and doubt, just like the Redwood incident. I never went back to the woods. Instead, I live in the cities I once avoided, surrounded by crowds. Yet, sometimes in the dead of night, I wake in a cold sweat, seeing the creature's glowing eyes watching me. I know that I haven't escaped it. Not really. It's still out there, waiting for its next victim, and I'm powerless to stop it. A few years ago, just before I got laid off, I took a trip to the Ozarks. I've always been fascinated by those hills, and I figured some hiking and maybe getting lost in the woods would do me some good. Reset the old brain, you know? Turns out I did get a reset, but not in the way I expected. The first few days were great, just me and the trees. The lodge I stayed at was decent, a little run down, but it was cheap. The people there were friendly enough. I heard some stories about missing hikers and bold wildlife, but I didn't think much of it. I mean, the woods are the woods. People get lost. Stuff happens, right? Things started getting strange on day 3. I was pretty far out, about 20 miles from the lodge, and hadn't seen another soul. I stopped for lunch by an old creek when I heard rustling in the bushes. I figured it was a squirrel or a bird. Wrong. I saw a flicker of movement, something big and dark, way too large to be a raccoon. Bigger than any deer around there, and whatever it was, it moved fast. I jumped to my feet, my heart racing. I thought maybe it was a bear or a wolf. I had a hunting knife, but let's be honest, that wouldn't have helped much against something that size. It disappeared into the bushes, and I tried convincing myself it was just my imagination, maybe a deer standing awkwardly in the shadows. But for the rest of the day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. You ever get that sense? Later that night, back at the lodge, I was having a beer on the porch when this old guy, Lemuel, came and sat next to me. He had to be at least 100, looked like he stepped out of an old black and white photo. He said, dead serious, "Son, you best be careful out there, you hear?" I chuckled, thinking he'd heard about my critter encounter earlier. But then he continued, "There's things in those woods folks don't talk about. Things older than these hills." I joked, "You don't believe in Bigfoot, do you?" He didn't even crack a smile. "I believe there's things out there you wouldn't recognize with your own two eyes," he said. The next day, I decided to check out the rumors. I hiked out to an old abandoned mine that was supposedly a hotspot for strange sightings. I'm not superstitious, but Lemuel's warning stuck with me. I figured daylight would chase away any creepy feelings. Reaching the mine was tough. It was way off the beaten path. I found an old collapsed entrance that looked like it had been sealed for years, but off to the side there was another opening, more like a natural cave. I figured it wouldn't hurt to take some pictures, but that's when the smell hit me. Rotten meat mixed with something musty. My stomach churned, but curiosity got the better of me, so I went in. The cave was pitch black, so dark I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. I had a small pen light, but it barely pierced the gloom. Something didn't feel right. The air was thick, and I could hear something dripping, like the cave was breathing. Then I froze. I heard a sound, a huff, like an animal breathing. Maybe it was wounded, or maybe it was cornered. I was too deep in, so I started inching backward, trying not to make any noise. That's when my light hit something huge, 2 legs, thick like tree trunks, covered in coarse dark fur. And then it moved. The creature growled, a low rumble that made my knees weak. That wasn't any animal I'd ever heard. Somehow I got my legs to move and ran toward the entrance, my light flickering wildly. I knew it was behind me, gaining on me. It smelled like fear, every ounce of fear I'd ever felt. I burst into the daylight, tripping over rocks, cutting my hands raw. I turned for one desperate look. The creature was massive, at least 7 feet tall, hunched over at the cave's entrance. It was built solid, with lean, rippling muscles. Its head was off, human-like, but with a heavy brow and a long, wolf-like muzzle. I saw its sharp, white teeth gleaming against its dark lips just before it let out a roar that echoed through the woods. I didn't stick around to get a better look. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like jelly. I didn't stop until I was back at the lodge, panting and drenched in sweat. Of course, no one believed me. They said it was a bear, that I was exaggerating. Some thought I made the whole thing up for attention. But Lemuel? He just nodded and told me I owed him a beer for the warning. I don't go deep into the Ozarks anymore. I still hike, but I stick to the trails. And at night, when I hear something outside the house, let's just say I check the locks twice and leave the light on. This happened to me in 1994. My name's Thaddeus Gillis, and before I tell you about that summer, you should know I wasn't always some wilderness hermit. Back then, I was fresh out of college, a city boy with more degrees than sense, thinking I'd save the world, one national park at a time. Reality has a way of showing you just how naive you are. The park, let's call it Red Ridge, wasn't exactly Yellowstone. It was remote, rugged, the kind of place even seasoned hikers thought twice about. My cabin was 7 miles in, accessible only by a dirt road that turned into a mud pit after a good rain. Most days, my job was to make sure tourists didn't wander off, get eaten by a bear, or fall into a ravine. Excitement wasn't on the agenda. That's why I didn't think much of it when the reports started coming in. Missing hikers, lost campers. It wasn't unusual in Red Ridge. People underestimated the wilderness. I figured they'd turn up eventually, a little worse for wear, but alive. Then the first body was found. A young couple, half buried near the creek, mauled. I'd seen bear attacks, but this wasn't like anything I'd ever encountered. The Park Service sent in a specialist, a grim man named Carter. He sniffed around, took samples, and muttered something about unusual predation. He wouldn't say more, but the look in his eyes made my skin crawl. The days dragged on, each one hotter than the last. The forest, usually peaceful, started to feel oppressive. I began seeing things out of the corner of my eye, movement in the shadows. I told myself it was just nerves, the heat playing tricks. But then the second body was found, a fisherman dragged from his boat, bones crushed, flesh torn. This time Carter didn't hide his unease. "Whatever did this," he said, his voice tight, "it's not natural." He brought in dogs, set up traps, and called for backup. The park was officially closed, but I stayed, more out of stubbornness than anything else. I wasn't about to let some animal, however strange, run me off. One night I was in my cabin reading by the kerosene lamp when I heard it, a sound like fingernails on bark, scratching against the wood just outside my window. It stopped, then started again, lower down, near the door. Fear, cold and sharp, shot through me. I grabbed the hunting rifle I kept by the bed, my heart hammering. I crept to the window and peered out into the darkness. Nothing. Just the wind in the leaves. But the scratching continued, persistent, deliberate. It was circling the cabin, testing the defenses. I held my breath, listening. Then a crash. The front door splintered and a dark shape surged inside. I fired, the shot deafening in the enclosed space. The creature shrieked, a sound that made my blood run cold. It wasn't a bear's roar nor a wolf's howl. This was something else, something wrong. It lunged, a blur of muscle and fury, knocking the rifle from my hands. I scrambled back, tripped over the table, and fell hard. The thing was on me in an instant, teeth bared, eyes burning with cold alien intelligence. I got my hands up, felt its claws rake across my arms. Hot pain shot through me. It stank, of rot and musk, overpowering. I punched, connected with something solid, felt it give. The creature roared again, shaking the cabin, but it hesitated. It was hurt. That moment of hesitation was all I needed. I rolled away, scrambled to my feet, and grabbed a heavy iron poker from beside the fireplace. It lunged again, and I swung with everything I had. The iron connected with a sickening crunch. The creature staggered back, a gurgling sound escaping its throat. It stared at me, its eyes now filled with something like fear. Slowly, it backed away, then turned and crashed through the remains of the door, disappearing into the night. I stood there, shaking, blood streaming down my arms. I had survived, but the encounter left a cold grip on my heart. What I had seen wasn't just an animal, it was something other. The official investigation concluded that a rogue bear was responsible for the deaths. But Carter, before he left, looked me in the eye and we shared a grim understanding. We both knew the truth. I never saw the creature again. Red Ridge was closed for good, deemed too dangerous. But even now, years later, when I hear a noise in the night, I can't help but remember those cold eyes, the scraping claws, and the stench of something ancient and evil. The wilderness holds its secrets, and some things, once seen, can never be unseen.
My name is Bomis Verer, and this happened to me on November 24th, 2007. Well, what do you know? Any day in paradise, or at least what passes for paradise here in the deep south, starts off with a toss of peanuts at the squirrel clinging to the window screen, a dumb grin on its furry face. Nature's little beggar, I muttered, lighting a cigarette. The rain hammered against the tin roof, a steady drumbeat against the quiet morning. Then, a shrill ring of the phone sliced through the air. I snatched it up. Vere residence, Bomis speaking. Mr. Vere? A woman's voice, lipped an official. "This is Deputy Brenson from the Marin County Sheriff's Department. We received a call regarding a situation at your property." Situation, a frown, glancing out the window at the rain-soaked fields. "What kind of situation?" "We've been informed of a possible incident involving one of your tenant farm." I let out a low whistle. "Tenant farmers? You mean old man Millerson? That old codger's been dead for years. We'll need you to come down and confirm, sir." The drive to Millerson's place was a slog through mud and rain. The old farmhouse stood hunched at the end of a long dirt track, its windows dark and vacant. Deputy Brenson, a young woman with a face like a slapped trout, met me by the porch and pointed toward the barn. "The call came from there," she said. "An anonymous tip said there was a disturbance." The barn door creaked open, revealing a scene straight out of a slaughterhouse. A man lay sprawled on the hay-strewn floor, his body twisted at an impossible angle, his face a mask of terror contorted in a silent scream. Blood pooled around him, turning the hay a sickening crimson. The stench of death and something else, something metallic and acrid, hung heavy in the air. Deputy Brenson covered her mouth with her hand, her face pale. "Jesus," whispered. I crouched beside the body. The dead man's vacant eyes stared up at me. It wasn't old man Millerson. This man was younger, his clothes torn and muddied. There were strange marks on his neck, deep punctures surrounded by bruised, swollen flesh. "Animal attack?" Brenson asked, her voice shaky. I shook my head. Whatever did this, it wasn't no animal I've ever seen. Days turned into weeks, and the investigation into the farmer's death hit a wall. Coroner's report was inconclusive, listing the cause of death as exsanguination due to unknown trauma. Wild animal attacks, cult ritual, even a deranged serial killer were all tossed around, each theory as unlikely as the next. The dead man remained unidentified, a John Doe with no past and a gruesome end. Life went on, or at least it tried to. The incident at the barn cast a long shadow. Whispers followed me like a stray dog. I spent my days working the fields, the silence broken only by the wind and the distant cries of cows. One evening, as dusk settled over the farm, I decided to take a walk. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. The woods bordering my property had always held a strange allure for me, a sense of mystery that drew me in. I followed a narrow trail deeper into the woods, the trees closing in around me, like a green tunnel. A rustling in the undergrowth caught my attention. I stopped, listening, my hand instinctively reaching for the hunting knife at my belt. The rustling grew louder, closer. A low growl sent a shiver down my spine. Suddenly, it burst from the bushes, a creature unlike anything I had ever seen. It was large, easily the size of a bear, but leaner, more agile. Skin was a patchwork of dark matted fur and leathery scales. Its head was elongated, the snout filled with rows of sharp teeth. Eyes, I couldn't describe them. They burned with an unnatural intelligence. Cold, predatory gleam. I froze, my mind struggling to comprehend what I was seeing. The creature let out a guttural snarl, its lips pulling back to reveal its teeth. It lunged, its claws slashing at me. I threw myself to the side, narrowly avoiding its razor-sharp talons. Adrenaline surged through me. I scrambled to my feet, my knife gripped tight. Creature circled me, eyes never leaving mine. Moved with an eerie grace, its powerful muscles rippling beneath it. I knew I couldn't outrun it. My only chance was to fight. I lunged forward, slashing at the creature with my knife. The blade connected with its shoulder, drawing a spray of blood. It let out a roar of pain and fury, its eyes blazing with hatred. We battled in the fading light, forest floor becoming a battlefield of blood and torn earth. Creature was fast and powerful, but I was driven by a primal urge to survive. I dodged its attacks, my knife finding its mark again and again. Finally, with a desperate lunge, I managed to plunge the knife deep into its chest. It let out a strangled cry, body convulsing, then collapsed, its eyes glazing over in death. I stood there panting, my body covered in wounds, clothes soaked in blood, my own and theirs. Creature lay still at my feet, grotesque form illuminated by the pale moonlight. It was over, or so I thought. Days later, news broke of another attack, this time in a neighboring county. A hiker was found dead in the woods, his body bearing the same gruesome marks as the farmer. Then another and another. The killing spread like a plague, each victim a grim testament to the creature's savagery. I knew I had to do something. Creature I had killed was not alone. There were more of them out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting to strike. I contacted the authorities, but my story was met with skepticism and disbelief. They dismissed it as the ramblings of a traumatized man, desperate attempt to make sense of the unexplainable. But I knew the truth, and I knew that I was the only one. It stopped. I spent the next few months preparing, honing my skills, gathering weapons and supply. I transformed my farm into a fortress, bulwark against the darkness that threatened to engulf the world. And then, one rainy night, they came. I heard them first, the sounds of their inhuman cries echoing through the woods. They emerged from the trees, their eyes glowing in the darkness, claws glinting in the moonlight. They were more numerous than I had imagined, a horde of nightmares come to life. I met them head-on, my guns blazing, my knives flashing. The night erupted in a cacophony of gunfire, roars, and screams. I fought with a ferocity born of desperation, each kill fueling my rage. They were relentless, their attacks coming from all sides. I felt their claws tearing at my flesh, their teeth gnashing at my bones. But I refused to give in. I would fight until my last breath, until every last one of them was dead. The battle raged for hours, the night sky lit by the flashes of gunfire and the eerie glow of the creature's eye. I was wounded, exhausted, but I kept fighting. Then, as the first rays of dawn began to break through the clouds, I saw him. He was larger than the others, his body a mass of muscle and sinew. His eyes burned with an intelligence that chilled me to the core. He was their leader, the alpha of the pack. He charged at me, his claws outstretched, his teeth bared in a silent snarl. I raised my gun, my finger tightening on the trigger. The shot echoed through the night, deafening roar that seemed to shake the very tree. The bullet found its mark, tearing through the creature's skull. It stumbled back, its body convulsing, and crashed to the ground, lifeless. A silence descended, broken only by the ragged gasps of my breath and the distant cries of retreating creatures. The battle was over. I had survived, but at what cost? My farm was a battlefield. littered with the bodies of the creatures and the spent casings of my weapon. I was wounded, my body a mass of cuts and bruises. My clothes were soaked in blood, my own and theirs. I collapsed onto the ground, my strength finally giving out. I lay there for what seemed like an eternity, staring up at the star-filled sky. A sense of despair washed over me. I had won the battle. The war was far from over. As the sun began to rise, casting its pale light over the carnage, I heard the distant sound of siren. Help was on the way. The next few days were a blur of activity. Police, paramedics, and news crews swarmed my farm. I was questioned, examined, and treated for my wounds. My story was met with disbelief at first. Evidence was undeniable. Bodies of the creatures, grotesque forms unlike anything ever seen before, spoke for themselves. News of the incident spread like wildfire. My farm became ground zero for a media frenzy. Scientists, cryptozoologists, and government officials descended upon the scene, eager to examine the creatures and unravel the mystery of their origin. I became an overnight celebrity. My story splashed across newspapers and television screens. I was hailed as a hero, a lone warrior who had saved the world from a terrifying threat. But I didn't feel like felt like a broken man, haunted by the memories. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had only won a temporary feat. There were more of them out there somewhere, waiting for their chance to strike. In the aftermath of the attack, my farm became a research site. Scientists dissected the creatures, analyzed their DNA, and searched for clues to their origin. They found that the creatures were unlike any known species. Their biology a bizarre mix of reptilian and mammalian traits. Their origins remained a mystery, a riddle that defied explanation. As the investigation continued, I began to receive threats. Anonymous letters and phone calls filled with hate and accusation. Some people believed that I was responsible for the creatures, that I had somehow created them or unleashed them upon the world. Others accused me of being a government agent, part of a vast conspiracy to control the population through fear. I ignored the threats, but they took their toll. I became withdrawn, paranoid, couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. I was haunted by nightmares, visions of the creatures returning, their claws tearing at my flesh, their teeth gnashing at my bones. One day, as I was walking through the woods near my farm, I came across a group of men. They were dressed in camouflage, heavily armed. They surrounded me, their faces grim. "You Bamas Verer?" one of them asked. I nodded. "We're here to take you in," he said. "You're under arrest." "Arrest?" I said. "For what?" "For the murder of those people on your farm," said. "Those creatures you claim attacked you." I tried to explain, to tell them the truth, but they wouldn't listen. They dragged me away, their guns pointed at my back. I was thrown into a cell, my pleas for help ignored. I was charged with multiple counts of murder, accused of fabricating the story of the creatures to cover up my crimes. Trial was a media circus. The prosecution painted me as a cold-blooded killer, a monster who had slaughtered innocent people in cold blood. The defense argued that I was a victim, a man who had been driven to violence by the creatures that had invaded his farm. The jury deliberated for days, their faces etched with doubt and confusion. Finally, they returned with a verdict: not guilty. I was free, The damage had been done. My life was in ruin. My farm was abandoned. My reputation was destroyed. I was a pariah, a man who had seen too much, who knew too much. I left town, disappearing into the anonymity of the city. I took odd jobs, living a life of solitude and obscurity, and I waited. I waited for the day when the creatures would return. I knew they would. They always did. When they did, I would be ready. The old man at the bar, his face weathered like a map of forgotten roads, leaned closer, his voice a low rasp. They call them the skulkers, he said. Those things. Always been stories, whispers in the dark, old Indian legends, tales of shadow creatures that stalk the night, feeding on the blood of the living. Skulkers. Fitting name for the creatures that had haunted my dreams, that had taken everything from me. I lowered the binoculars, my hand trembling. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it was responsible for the disappearances. Knew it was the source of that metallic, sickening stench. I stayed in the tower until the sun rose, watching as the creature melted back into the trees, disappearing as if it were part of the shadows themselves. I radioed headquarters, told them what I'd seen. They didn't believe me. Roundtree, a gruff voice crackled over the radio. We've been getting reports about you seeing things, shadows, noises. Hell, you even reported a talking bear last month. You're out there alone too long. Take a few days off, clear your head. I knew arguing was pointless. They wouldn't believe me until it was too late, until whatever that thing was took someone else. The next few days were a blur of tension and frustration. I couldn't shake the image of the creature from my mind. That pale skin, that unnatural jaw, the way it gnawed on that bone. It haunted my dreams, crept into my waking thoughts. I tried to warn people, hikers, campers, even the locals who lived on the fringes of the forest. They listened politely. Some even offered me a sympathetic pat on the shoulder. But I could see the doubt in their eyes. The unspoken question, was old Cade finally losing it? Then came the news that confirmed my worst fears. A young couple on their honeymoon vanished from their campsite near the Catwalk Recreation Area. Their tent was found ripped open, their belongings scattered, and that same metallic stench hung heavy in the air. This time, they couldn't ignore it. The story made the local news, then the state papers. Search parties were organized. Helicopters buzzed overhead. The couple remained missing. I was out in the woods every day, searching, hoping, praying that I was wrong. But deep down, I knew what had become of them. One afternoon, I was following a game trail near the West Fork Gila River, my senses on high alert. The air was thick with the smell of pine needles and damp earth. Beneath it, a faint whiff of that metallic odor lingered. I heard a splash, then a strangled cry. I ran, my heart pounding in my chest. Bursting through a thicket of willows, I saw it. Creature was hunched over by the riverbank, its back to me. It was tearing at something, its long pale arms working with a frenzy that chilled me to the bone. I yelled a primal scream of rage and fear. Creature whirled around, its face a mask of raw, animalistic hunger. It dropped its prey, a mangled, unrecognizable mass, and stared at me with eyes that were black and empty, devoid of any trace of humanity. We stood there for a long moment, the only sound the rushing of the river and the hammering of my heart. Then, with a guttural snarl that seemed to come from the depths of its being, creature lunged. I stumbled back, tripping over a root and falling hard. The creature was on me in an instant, its weight crushing the air from my lungs. I felt its claws rake across my face, hot pain searing through me. I bucked and thrashed, my fists connecting with something hard and bony. The creature shrieked, a high-pitched, piercing sound that echoed through the trees. Reared back, giving me a precious moment to scramble away. I scrambled to my feet, my vision blurry with pain and adrenaline. Creature was still there, watching me, its eyes burning with a malevolent intensity. I backed away slowly, never taking my eyes off it. I stumbled back to the ranger station, my face a bloody mess, clothes torn. I told them everything, showed them the claw marks, the bloodstains on my clothes. This time, they listened. They had to. The evidence was right there on my face. They sent out a search party, armed and cautious. They found the remains by the riverbank. Gruesome testament to the creature's savagery. The remains of the young couple were never found. The search for the creature continues. So far, it has eluded capture. It's out there somewhere in the vast wilderness of the Gila. A nightmare made flesh, a predator that walks on two legs, driven by an insatiable hunger that we can barely comprehend. They say they've found footprints, strange three-toed prints unlike anything they've ever seen. They say they've heard it at night. High-pitched keening sound that sends shivers down the spine. I'm no longer a ranger. The attack left me scarred both physically and mentally. But I can't shake the feeling that it's not over. Somewhere out there in the dark heart of the Gila, that creature is waiting, watching, and one day it will hunt again. This happened to me in 1953. I'm Cade Rurai, and let me tell you, folks in my line of work see some strange stuff. I spent 20 years as a park ranger in the Gila National Forest. 20 years of sun-baked trails, towering pines, and nights so dark you could lose yourself. It started with the disappearances. Hikers mostly, going out for a day trip and never coming back. Then a couple of hunters, their truck found abandoned near the Gila cliff dwellings. No bodies, no signs of struggle, just gone. Park Service brass chalked it up to accidents, wild animals, maybe even foul play between hikers gone sour. I wasn't so sure. There was something off about the whole thing, a stillness that hung in the air, a prickling on the back of my neck I couldn't shake. Then came the finding. First was a boot half buried in the mud near a creek. I remember thinking it looked chewed, leather ragged and torn in a way that didn't sit right. A few days later, I found a backpack, straps shredded, contents scattered and half-eaten. The stench was awful, a mix of rot and something else, something metallic and acrid. I radioed it in, sent the findings to headquarters. They said they'd look into it, sent out a couple of extra rangers to patrol the area. But nobody wanted to say what I was thinking. Something was hunting in the Gila, and it wasn't a mountain lion or a bear. One night, I was on fire watch duty up in the Milan Mountain. We'd had a dry spell, lightning storms cracking through the tinder-dry forests. I was posted up at an old fire tower, a lonely vigil with just the wind and the distant calls of owls beneath. I was brewing coffee on my little propane stove when I heard it. A rustle in the trees below, heavy thud, then silent. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out onto the platform, scanning the moonlit clearing below. Nothing. Just the wind rustling the leaves, shadows dancing in the moonlight. I told myself it was a deer or maybe a coyote, but the unease was back. Cold fists squeezing at my gut. I finished my coffee, kept my eyes peeled. The woods stayed silent, but I felt watched, observed. Just before dawn, I saw it. It was moving through the trees at the edge of the clearing, its silhouette barely visible against the pre-dawn light. Tall, bipedal, moving with a strange jerky gait. I raised my binoculars, squinting through the lenses. It wasn't human. The limbs were too long, the proportions all wrong. Its head was small, almost shrunken, perched atop a thick, hunched neck, and its skin was hairless, pale, almost translucent in the dim light. I watched it as it moved, movements clumsy but strangely purposeful. Stopped by a fallen log, bent over and picked something up. A bone, white and gleaming in the half-light, brought the bone to its mouth, its jaw unhinging in a way that shouldn't be possible, and began to gnaw. Folks call me Ellis Cooper. I spent my younger days running with a rough crowd in Boston. That life ain't for everyone. I found myself drawn to the quiet, craving for some peace and fresh air. So I traded the city streets for a secluded cabin in the Adara. It was 1980. Reagan was elected, John Lennon was shot, and Mount St. Helens blew her top. I watched it all on my black and white Zenith TV, the signal fuzzy but the news clear. World felt far away, and that's how I liked it. Days were filled with chopping wood, fishing for trout in the nearby stream, and the occasional visit from Joe, my nearest neighbor, a half-mile trek through the woods. Then, things started getting strange. Joe went missing. One day he was grumbling about the rising price of gasoline, the next he was gone without a trace. I didn't think much of it at first, figuring he'd gone into town for supplies. But a week passed, then 2, and still no sign of him. His dog, a mangy mutt named Buster, showed up at my doorstep, whimpering and looking starved. I took him in, but unease settled in my gut. The nights grew longer, filled with the rustle of leaves and the snap of twigs. Shadows danced on the walls, cast by the flickering flames in my fireplace, taking on shapes that sent shivers down my spine. Then came the smell, a sickly sweet stench that clung to the air like a shroud. It was the smell of decay, death, and it seemed to emanate from the woods. One night, a sound pierced the silence. A scream that cut through the darkness like a blade. It was a woman's scream, filled with terror and pain. I grabbed my old Winchester, a relic from my grandfather, and cautiously made my way towards the sound. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting an eerie glow on the forest floor. I found her lying there, barely recognizable. It was Sarah, a young hiker who'd passed by a few days earlier. Her body was mangled, torn apart as if by some wild animal, but the wounds were too precise, too clean. This wasn't the work of any bear or mountain lion. Cold dread washed over me. I'd heard the old tales, the whispers of a creature that roamed these woods, being that wasn't quite human, not quite animal. They called it the Rend, a shadow in the moonlight, a predator that feasted on flesh and bone. I raced back to my cabin, barricading the door, heart pounding in my chest. I loaded the Winchester and kept vigil by the window, the darkness pressing against the glass like a living thing. The night stretched on, each creak of the house a hammer blow to my nerves. At dawn, I ventured out. The rising sun cast long shadows that seemed to twist and writhe. I found prints in the mud, large, elongated tracks that didn't belong to any creature I'd ever seen. They led towards the dense undergrowth, disappearing into the heart of the forest. The Rend had come, and it had taken Sarah. But why? What did it want? These questions haunted me as I packed my belongings, knowing I couldn't stay here. This wasn't just a threat, it was a death sentence. I left a note for the authorities on Joe's door, plea for them to investigate Sarah's death. Then, with Buster at my heels, I set off down the mountain, leaving behind the cabin that had been my sanctuary, now tainted by the horrors of the night. I spent the next few days in a cheap motel in the nearest town, haunted by nightmares of the Rend's glowing eyes and Sarah's screams. The news was filled with the Iran hostage crisis and the miracle on ice, but my mind was consumed by the darkness lurking in the woods. Police never found Joe. His disappearance, along with Sarah's gruesome death, was attributed to a rogue bear, a convenient explanation that ignored the chilling truth. As for me, I drifted from town to town, haunted by the memory of the Rend, unable to find peace. Years passed, the world changed, the Berlin Wall fell, the internet became a thing, and I grew older, the lines on my face a map of the horrors I'd witnessed. But the Adara, those ancient mountains shrouded in mystery, never left my thoughts. One day a newspaper article caught my eye. A young couple had gone missing while hiking in the same area where I'd encountered the Rend. The article mentioned strange tracks, foul odor, and a chilling scream heard in the night. Bold dread settled over me, familiar feeling I'd hoped never to experience again. I knew then that the Rend was still out there, preying on the unsuspecting, its hunger insatiable. The thought of it returning to my old cabin, to the woods that had once been my haven, filled me with a rage I hadn't felt in years. I returned to the Adara, ghost from the past, drawn back to the place of my nightmares. The cabin stood as I'd left it, weathered and worn but still standing. The woods, however, seemed darker, more menacing. The silence was broken only by the mournful hoot of an owl. I waited, armed with my Winchester, and a heart hardened by grief, anger. Night after night, I patrolled the perimeter of my property, my eyes scanning the shadows, my ears straining for any sound. One moonless night, as the wind whispered through the trees, I heard it. A rustle of leaves, a snapping twig, the unmistakable sound of something moving through the undergrowth. I raised my rifle, my finger tightening on the trigger. A figure emerged from the darkness, its silhouette barely visible against the night sky. It was the Rend, its elongated limbs and grotesque head silhouetted against the moon. It moved with a swiftness that defied its size, its glowing eyes fixed on me. This time, I wouldn't run. I wouldn't cower in fear. I raised the Winchester and fired, the shot echoing through the silent woods. The creature staggered, a guttural growl escaping its throat. I fired again and again, each shot a punctuation mark in the symphony of violence. The Rend lunged, its claws outstretched, but I was ready. I dodged its attack and plunged my hunting knife into its chest, the blade sinking deep into its flesh. The creature let out a blood-curdling shriek, its body convulsing before collapsing onto the forest floor. I stood over the fallen beast, the stench of its blood filling my nostrils. It was over. The Rend was dead. Its reign of terror finally ended. I had avenged Sarah, Joe, and all the others who had fallen prey to this abomination. But the victory was hollow. The woods were still silent, shadows still long. The Rend was gone, but the fear remained, constant reminder of the darkness that lurked beneath the surface of this seemingly peaceful world. I left the Adair that day, the weight of the past heavy on my shoulders. I never returned. I approached slowly, keeping to cover. It was a small fire, just enough for one person. Whoever set up camp here wasn't planning on staying long. Then I saw their gear. A beat-up pack, a sleeping bag unrolled directly on the ground, a couple of water jugs. It looked like someone was living out here, roughing it in the wild. That thought scared me, more than a truck full of bloodstains. There are reasons you don't see folks setting up permanent in those parts. The desert can kill even an experienced hiker. So who was this? Some kind of survivalist nut? Fugitive? I started edging backward, ready to vanish back into the rocks, and I stepped on a dry twig. It snapped loud in the desert stillness. A voice rasped out, "Who's there?" I went very still. The voice sounded old, parched. I didn't answer. "Come on out. I don't bite much anymore. Leastways not hard." It tried to chuckle, but the sound was more like a dry cough. Slowly, I emerged from the brush by the fire. Crouched was an old man, if you could even call him a man. He was skin and bones, clad in tatters of sun-faded clothes. His hair and beard were long, matted, and his skin had the same leathery texture as cured boot leather. But it was his eyes that got me, black, sunken deep in their sockets, shining with a mad hunger. "Lost, are you?" he asked, his lips barely moving around the words. He gestured at my pack. "Hiker, huh? Got food?" I couldn't help it. Took a step back. That look in his eyes wasn't just desperation. It was something else. Something primal. That's when he stood up, and I understood why I thought the figure on the ridge looked wrong. He was tall, impossibly tall for how bony he was. And his arms, God, his arms were too long, ending in thick, knotted fingers that twitched like spider legs. I lost it then, turned and ran, not even looking back. The man thing didn't let out a yell behind me. He moved with a kind of unnatural speed. Those spindly limbs shouldn't have allowed, keeping low to the ground as he gave chase. I ran until my lungs burned, until rocks sliced up my hands, until my legs finally buckled beneath me. I skidded across a patch of gravel, gasping for breath. He was getting closer, close enough that I could smell him. A sour, acrid stench like rotten meat left in the sun. I scrambled to my feet and kept going, but it was no use. He was loping alongside me now, just yards away, that mad glint in his eyes, his mouth stretched in a grotesque grin. Just when I thought he was going to leap, he stopped ahead. I saw why. The trail cut sharply off. Beyond it was a sheer drop, 100 feet at least, down to the canyon floor. Crouched by the edge, tilting his head and regarding me, and that's when it hit me. This wasn't a chase. He was hurting me. My survival instincts took over. He wanted me to jump. Fine. I wouldn't give him the satisfaction. I looked around desperately. There, up the hillside, a narrow fissure in the rock, barely wide enough for a man to pass. I sprinted toward it, ignoring the pain of my throbbing legs. The man-thing let out a weird guttural cry like an animal in frustration, but he didn't follow. I clawed my way up the fissure, squeezing and hauling myself inch by inch. Rocks came loose, tumbled down the slope towards him. He hissed and retreated back from the edge. Up I climbed until the fissure spat me out at the edge of a plateau. I lay there panting, heart pounding against my ribs, not daring to look back. I just knew I had to keep moving. I staggered on, following the curve of the rocks, looking for another way down. I don't know how long I spent wandering. Time lost its meaning. Just thirst, blazing sun, and the ever-present awareness of being watched. I found water eventually. Fetid little seep in the rocks. Drinking it made me feel worse. Night fell, and it brought no relief. The man-thing's eyes seemed to burn in the darkness. Thin pinpricks of malevolent light that followed my every move. Tried to find a hiding spot, but it was useless. He always knew where I was. By sunrise I was delirious. I stumbled out onto a ledge, the desert stretching out before me, vast and empty. And there, on the edge of the precipice, he waited, crouched, ready, as if the whole thing had been an elaborate hunt leading to this moment. Something in me snapped. I wasn't going to die cowering. I charged forward, yelling a primal scream that split the dry air. The impact took me clean off my feet. We tumbled together, him clawing at me, a flurry of limbs and dust, and then open air. There was no time for fear, just a sense of falling. Sun-scorched earth rushing up to meet me. They found my body 2 weeks later. Search and rescue team guided to the spot by my ranger buddy, who got worried when I didn't make a scheduled check-in. The official cause of death was the fall, of course. Broken neck, multiple fractures, works. The weirdness was the state of the remains, born and shredded as if some big animal got at it. And my face. They said it was frozen in a mask of terror. It's pretty accurate, if you ask me. They never found the truck, never found the old man thing either. That part of Death Valley still has its secret. Places where maps are blank. I'd learned that the hard way. And somewhere out there, maybe it's still waiting. The desert folk, locals who've seen a thing or two, tell stories of a creature, a scavenger haunting the wastes, a tall, gaunt thing with insatiable hunger and eyes that glow in the dark. They don't give it a name, just whispers, inside sideways glances. They don't need to. I saw it and I know. The year was 1976. And I was headed for a long weekend in the wilds of Death Valley National Park. You might think I'm crazy, a solo hike in the hottest spot in the country during peak summer, but I've always had a thing for those kinds of extreme. Name's Leo James, and I work in construction. Nothing fancy, just backhoes and concrete, but it keeps a man strong and gives him an appreciation for a bit of open space come vacation time. This trip would be a little different. I wasn't trekking some marked trail, oh no. I'd gotten a ranger buddy of mine to mark up a map with a secret route. Kind of tough scramble with gorgeous, desolate views known only to a few. It looked like pure hell. It was just the way I liked it. The first day out, that California heat hit hard, but it was nothing a prepared guy like me couldn't handle. The second day, though, that's when things got weird. You wouldn't expect many folks in that part of the park, right? Remote doesn't even describe it. Cracked, baked earth, salt flats, and canyons like raw scars cut in the rock. Yet late afternoon, I came across a truck. An old pickup, rust-flecked and half-sunken into the sandy ground. Now, my dad was a mechanic. He always preached caution. Leave what you don't understand alone, son, especially out where the sun will fry your brains. I couldn't just walk on by. The thing looked abandoned for months, maybe years, so I took a closer look. Big mistake. The interior was trashed, ripped seats, windows shattered, and there was this stain on the passenger seat. Dark and spattered, dried blood. That was my first thought. My skin prickled, and not from the sun this time. From the edge of my vision I saw it, movement up on a ridge. Something was up there, watching me. It was too far, too obscured by the haze for me to see it clearly, but the shape didn't look right. Not an animal, more like a person, but lanky, too tall. That was enough. I bolted, heart pounding, putting distance between me and that truck. I found camp and tried to forget what I saw. The next morning, I woke up feeling watched. That same unease settled on me, like when you know a predator has you in its sights. My footsteps felt heavy on the trail. I wanted to look back every minute, but Dad's voice echoed in my head, "Don't let him see your fear." The rest of the day passed without any sightings, but it didn't bring relief. If anything, that dread got worse. Evening came, and I stopped short. Up ahead, a good 100 yards was a campfire. That wouldn't be strange on an ordinary trail, but out here, that meant someone else had found this little undiscovered path of mine. I crouched low in the brush, trying to decide what to do. Part of me, the cautious part, said abort. Leo, pack up, backtrack, and get the hell out. But another part, the foolhardy part, the part that got me into these extreme trips to begin with, said go on, see who it is. My name is Ben Shepherd, and this happened to me in September of 1994. I'm a national park ranger stationed in the Appalachian Mountains, Blue Ridge Parkway, to be exact. I've been working these woods for longer than I care to remember. My old man was a ranger too, best kind. I kinda grew up in these forests. That fall, things started to feel off. It started subtly, barely noticeable, like a shift in the breeze. Rangers began reporting hikers going missing. No bodies, no sign of struggle, just vanished off the trails. They blamed folks getting lost, disoriented. Deep down, I felt there was something more, like a chill wind coming from a place you couldn't see. Then came the stories from other rangers. At night, out on patrol, they'd claim to hear footsteps in the underbrush when they were alone, feel like they were being followed despite the silence. One old-timer, a guy named Flynn, even said he swore he saw eyes, big, glowing yellow eyes, peering back at him from the tree line, disappearing in a blink. The higher-ups laughed it off. Stress, bad moonshine, the usual dismissal. One evening, as I was closing up a section of the parkway, I stumbled on it myself. Pause for all the unsettling stories. Deep in the woods, off a little used maintenance trail, I found a clearing. In the center of it were bones, piles of them. Deer, bear, sure, something else mixed. Bones too big, too oddly shaped, and scattered amongst the animal remains were torn bits of clothing, a mangled back. My heart pounded in my chest. This wasn't natural, not normal at all. Right then, my radio crackled with Flynn's voice. Bennett. He said he was out on the trail. Said he saw it. Thing that was making those eyes. Then the audio cut out. I ran, following the trail toward the spot he'd radioed in from. Every instinct told me to go back, get help. But Flynn had been like family, and my gut said he was in trouble. Night was falling fast when I reached the edge of the woods, peering into an overgrown meadow. There, in the waning light, it stood. Preacher. I couldn't make out all the details. The sheer scale of it was enough to make my knees wobble. Close to 10 feet tall, covered in matted fur that shimmered silver in the moonlight. Its arms were like tree trunks, its hands tipped with claws that ripped into the earth. And the head, that was the worst. A mix of wolf and man, twisted and wrong, yellow eyes blazing. For a heartbeat, we just stood there, frozen. Then it let out a roar that echoed through the mountains, the raw sound of fury and hunger. Flynn cried out from somewhere in the meadow, his voice filled with pain and terror. That snapped me into action. I charged forward, yelling, trying to draw the creature away. It turned, and in the dim light, Its teeth flashed in a grotesque grin. I heard Flynn scream again, and the sound cut off abruptly. Creature turned back toward me, and for a second I thought about running. Flynn was out there, maybe even still alive, and that creature wasn't going to let me go without a fight. My heart was a drumbeat in my ears as I raised my rifle, more of an act of defiance than actual strategy. I hadn't even reloaded since firing warning shots at a mama bear a few weeks back. This thing, bullets wouldn't even slow it down. Yet I aimed. Creature stalked closer, its eyes fixated on me. I squeezed the trigger. The shot echoed, useless. It roared and lunged. I braced, then silent. My eyes flew open. Creature had stopped just feet in front of me, its massive form frozen in mid-pounce. Confused, I scrambled back, then noticed what had stopped it in its tracks. Flickering headlamp bobbing through the trees. Then a voice, rough and familiar. "Don't move. That thing hates light." It was Old Man Flynn, battered and bleeding, but miraculously alive. He dragged himself into view, one hand clutching the headlamp, the other an old heavy-duty flashlight. As he got closer, the creature hissed and retreated a few steps, its eyes narrowing against the concentrated beams. "Keep those lights on it." Flynn croaked, his face pale. "Come on, move." I didn't need telling twice. Stumbling to my feet, I shuffled toward Flynn. Creature watched, snarling, but the fearsome predator from before seemed held at bay by the harsh light, unable to approach. Flynn collapsed against a tree, and I knelt beside him. His leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, bone jutting through torn skin. "Hold this." He thrust the heavy flashlight at me. "Aim it straight at that thing." With shaking hands, I took the flashlight. Its beams seemed to make the creature agitated, keeping it at a distance. As I helped Flynn splint his leg, fashioning a makeshift support from branches, we kept those lights trained on the predator, snarls filling the night. When the makeshift splint was secured, Flynn slumped back, exhausted. "They told me I was crazy," he rasped with a dark chuckle, rasping in his throat. "Said it was bears, wildcats. Never believed they'd believe this." Suddenly the creature charged again, a blur of dark fur and aggression. We both screamed, holding the light steady. It stopped short, as if hitting an invisible wall. Then it paced back and forth, watching us with calculating eyes. "Can't hold it forever," Flynn muttered. "Sun's coming up soon." But he trailed off, grimacing. We both knew what that meant. We'd be sitting ducks come daylight. That's when I saw it. Fire lookout tower flashing on a distant ridge. An old beacon, hardly ever used anymore. Maybe, just maybe, I laid out my plan to Flynn. Desperate gamble at best. He nodded slowly, wincing as he shifted his injured leg. Crazy enough to work, grunted. With Flynn providing cover, keeping the creature pinned with the flashlights, I crept backward into the undergrowth. I had to get to the base of the tower unseen if this had any chance. Inch by painful inch, I moved. The creature paced restlessly as it sensed me pulling away. Then I was free of its sightline, scrambling towards the tower on my belly. The base of the tower was an old metal shed filled with outdated equipment and forgotten maps. Inside I struck gold. Flares. I grabbed them, heart pounding, then began the terrifying climb up the narrow ladder of the tower. The creature must have sensed the change in elevation, 'cause it roared in frustration, scrabbling against the base of the tower. As I reached the top, I secured myself, broke tight, fumbled with the flare. Flickering crimson light sparked to life, and with a prayer, I hurled it down. The flare bounced off a rock near the creature and exploded. It screeched, recoiling from the blinding flash. Encouraged, I lit another and another, tossing them into the clearing. Creature thrashed and howled, clearly in pain from the sudden bursts of light. I didn't stop, my hand shaking as I fumbled for the last flare. Then, as dawn broke, creature turned and fled, disappearing into the forest with astonishing speed. When the search team finally arrived, we told them the unbelievable truth. They found footprints larger than any bear, clearing littered with bones. Whatever that creature was, it was still out there. The aftermath was a blur. Flynn recovered, though he walked with a limp for the rest of his days. I never saw the creature again, but I feel it sometimes, prickling at the back of my neck, that lingering sense of being watched from the encroaching darkness of the trees. We got transferred, both of us. Bad for morale, the suit said, sweeping it all under the rug. I moved on, got a desk job, pushing paper instead of patrolling trails. Safer, I said. Maybe. But sometimes, in the dead quiet of my office, I swear I can smell the rankness of the woods, hear the echoing roar, and feel the heat of those burning yellow eyes fixed on me in the deep, unending dark. The next morning, I told Bill and my old man what I saw. They figured it was probably just a bear or a moose, and they didn't seem too concerned. It put me on edge, though, the idea of something out there watching us. That day, we set up our positions. This was the plan. Bill would do some calls to attract elk. My old man and I would be concealed down the trail, waiting for one to come into view. We went to our spots, set up camp chairs, waited. Bill started with this bugling noise, high-pitched and kind of eerie, echoing through the trees. Then we waited. My old man was quiet. He was deadly serious when hunting. We sat there for hours, the trees still and silent all around us. Then that damn rustling started again. I was sure it was coming from behind us, from the direction of the cabin. I was antsy. Something was off. I looked at the old man. He motioned with his chin, his eyes scanning the line of trees as steadily as before. I tried to ignore what was creeping me out. Then Bill bugled again, and something answered. It was a crash of branches. Something big was moving through the dense undergrowth. Then silence. And then steps. Slow, heavy thudding steps. They were close, too close. Something was on our trail. Something huge, and it was definitely not an elk. Suddenly I saw it. A giant, hairy shape like nothing I'd ever seen. At least 8, maybe even 9 feet tall, striding through the trees like it owned the place. It was bipedal, walking on 2 legs, but not like a human. More like an ape, covered in thick dark fur, with huge claws on its hands and a long tapered snout. My blood ran cold. Bill always told us to be prepared for anything out here, but I don't think he meant this. The old man next to me had gone completely still. I think he saw it too, but he didn't make a sound. The huge creature got within 30 feet of us, then it just stopped. I looked it straight on, but I couldn't see its eyes in the shadows under the trees. My pulse was racing, I swore my heart was loud enough for that thing to hear. The thing looked curious, almost like it was studying us. For a terrifying, insane moment, I thought it might try to communicate. But then it let out this bone-chilling growl, low and rumbling, rising in its throat. And it charged. My old man was already on his feet. He fired his rifle. Boom! So loud it nearly deafened me. He fired again and again. I fumbled for my rifle as fast as I could, hands shaking. The thing was fast, unbelievably fast. I could see the muscle and sinew rippling under that dark fur, but it was big, and with each shot from the old man I could see it flinch, slowing down a touch. That's when I got my aim and fired again and again. It roared in pain, a mix of fury and anguish, and it stumbled back. The ground under its feet shook, and it knelt into a tree, the impact sending dead branches flying. I felt a surge of relief. Maybe we'd heard it. Maybe we had a chance. But the darn thing wasn't done. It lunged back up, scrambling through the trees like a wounded, vengeful beast. We kept firing, just kept firing, until the shots echoed through the entire forest. And then, just like that, it vanished. The trees went silent, only the heavy echoes of our gunshots bouncing between the ancient pines. The gunshots shattered the stillness, and for a moment, the only sound was the rain of spent cartridges hitting the forest floor. Then we stared at the spot where the thing had been, but there was nothing. No cries of pain, no thrashing or crashing through the trees. We waited, 1 minute, 2. Every muscle in my body was coiled in tense anticipation, hands slick with sweat on the stock of my rifle. I caught sight of my old man's face, weathered, etched with the same taut mix of concern and determination that I knew was reflected in my own. We slowly moved forward, rifles raised and ready, following the trail of broken branches and overturned leaves. No blood, no sign of where that monstrous thing could have disappeared to. Then I saw it, a single huge footprint pressed into the soft earth, deep and clawed. Not human, not an animal I'd ever learned about. This thing was real. As real as the gun in my hands, and that made it terrifying. We couldn't find it after that frantic, adrenaline-soaked chase. Thing was gone. We backtracked all the way to the cabin, Bill, my dad, and myself. On high alert, senses straining for any sound that wasn't the wind or the crunch of needles beneath our boots. There was nothing but an unsettling emptiness that hung heavier than the twilight. Back at the cabin, we barricaded the door, checked every window, and hunkered down to wait. Bill lit the old wood stove, and the flickering warmth did little to chase back the chill in my bones. We didn't speak much, no need to state the obvious. Out there in those dark woods, we weren't alone. We kept watch through the night, taking shifts and napping in fitful bursts. Every creak of wood or gust of wind jolting me fully awake. Sleep felt like a luxury, a weakness. Finally, dawn came, filtering through the dense pines, a weak gray light. The moment it was light enough to see, we ventured out with rifles in hand, searching the perimeter. Still no trace of the creature, but that feeling, that primal instinct screaming that we were being watched, never went away. That afternoon, we packed up in grim silence. There was no need for words. We all knew we couldn't stay. This trip was over, a nightmare we'd luckily survived. We left the cabin, Bill taking the lead, my old man and I behind him, covering his back. We hiked in a tight formation, eyes scanning every flicker of movement in the trees. We drove for hours, barely a word spoken in the truck. My mind raced, trying to process what we'd seen. Couldn't have been real, but I knew deep down it was. Couldn't let this go, couldn't pretend it hadn't happened. I wasn't crazy. When we reached the next town, we went straight to the local police station. I felt ridiculous recounting the tale, a 9-foot-tall, hairy monster roaming the woods of Montana. The officers exchanged worried glances, humor dancing in their eyes. I expected disbelief, even mockery. Then one of the officers, a weathered older man named Roy, leaned forward with interest. We get reports of strange sightings up in those mountains. Usually folks just passing through, tourists seeing things after dark, he said. Never been able to substantiate anything, though. You mind if I ask where you were camped out? I described the location to him. He nodded grimly. Yeah, we had a group of hikers go missing up there a couple of years back, said slowly, weighing his words. Never found a trace of them. A wave of nausea washed over me. People had disappeared there, and we had come so close. My old man put his hand on my shoulder. I looked at him and saw the same realization mirrored in his eye. We weren't alone, and this had been going on longer than we imagined. Officer Roy took a detailed report, every aspect of our encounter, every description we could offer of that impossible creature. We felt less insane once it was on paper. Maybe with a physical record of our experience, police could maybe there would be a warning to others. Maybe they'd find something, some hint about what this thing was. After leaving the police station, a silence fell over us as we climbed back into Bill's truck. There was an understanding now, a knowledge deeper than words could express. We drove away from that small town. I never looked back. Memory stayed with me, though. In the nights after, in the quiet of my own room with the curtains drawn shut, I would see that dark shape against the trees. I would hear the crashing steps, the throaty growl of something inhuman. Memory of the terror was as potent as the day it happened. But I also remembered the look on Officer Roy's face, remembered the way his eyes narrowed, not with dismissal, but a spark of something else. Determination that maybe, just maybe, the mountains of Montana hid something more than trees and wild. Maybe with enough people taking notice, we could understand what was unseen, name the monster hiding in plain sight. My name is Ethan, and this happened to me in 2018. My old man and I decided to try a different vacation that year. It was just the two of us. My mom stayed home. My old man is a hunter, and we decided to do this crazy hunting trip to Montana. I've hunted with him forever, mostly white-tailed deer, but we thought it would be fun to go for something different and try to bag a big elk. He loves the mountains, and so do I. We researched for weeks, booked a guide, and got all of our stuff packed up. Montana was a long drive, but we'd planned some scenic stops along the way. First few days of getting there were fun. We passed through giant rolling grasslands, then hit the mountains. It was all trees and snow, different from back home. We stopped off at this huge natural spring. The water was hot and smelled like rotten eggs. My old man laughed at my face. Finally, a couple of days into our long drive, we hit our spot in Montana. It was a huge swath of national forest. Pretty remote. I have to say I was glad we hired a guide because it was so remote, and this guy knew the lay of the land. His name was Bill. He was a big old bear of a man with a thick beard and a funny way of talking, but he seemed like he knew his stuff. Bill set us up in a little cabin just on the edge of the wilderness area. Rustic, basic, but it did the trick. It had an old pot-bellied stove and enough firewood to last us. The first night was pretty easy. We just cooked up some chili we brought. Bill showed us the area on a map and we got some sleep. The next morning, bright and early, Bill knocked on our door and took us deeper into the forest. We were looking for elk, those big, majestic, deer-like creatures. We hiked for hours. Man, it was different from back home. Much steeper hills and denser woods. We were getting higher in altitude too, and all that climbing with our packs left me huffing and puffing. We heard some rustling a few times in those first few days. Never actually saw an elk. Bill said they were shy, skittish, and easily spooked. The old man just joked about how I was probably scaring them off with all my grunting and sweating. He's a real comedian. Bill told us to stay quiet, stay disciplined, and eventually we'd catch our elk. Then, that night, fourth night of the trip, something felt off. I woke up in the pitch dark. It was quiet, too quiet. No crickets chirping or wind through the trees like the usual outdoors background noise. Then I heard it, a low rustling from outside the cabin. I nudged the old man, but he just grumbled and rolled over. I got up, heart pounding, and peeked out the dusty window. That's when I saw its shadow. Huge, way bigger than any human, hunched against the old tree trunk by the shed. Now, I'm not a superstitious guy, but something felt wrong about that shadow. Just stood there, still as a statue, as if it knew I was watching. You could say that, I muttered, signaling for another drink. Told her about the creature, about the deer carcass, about the chase through the woods. She listened, her expression a mix of skepticism and concern. There's been talk, she said, wiping down the counter with a rag. People disappearing in the woods. Hikers, campers, never seen again. A chill ran down my spine. You think it's the same thing? I asked. She shrugged. Could be. Or maybe it's just bears or wolves. I finished my drink, the whiskey burning a hole in my gut. I don't think so, I said. This was something else. Something evil. Darla gave me a long look. Be careful out there, she said. These woods, they hold secret. I nodded, paid for my drinks, and went back to the truck. Barnaby was curled up in the back seat, his eyes closed. I started the engine, headed back towards the highway. The sun had set, sky a canvas of fading light. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. But the creature was out there somewhere, lurking in the shadows. I drove through the night, the headlights cutting through the darkness. Every rustle of leaves, every shadow on the road set my heart racing. Reached home just before dawn, exhausted but unable to sleep. The image of the creature, its featureless face and gaping maw, haunted my thoughts. I knew I couldn't just forget what I'd seen. I had to do something. But what? I was just a regular guy, a salesman with a mortgage and a bad back. What could I possibly do against a creature like? I paced the floor, my mind racing. Then I remembered something Darla had said. These woods, they hold secret. Maybe there was something out there. Something that could help me understand what I'd encountered. Something that could help me fight back. I sat down at my computer, started researching. Read about local legends, folklore, creatures of the night. Hours passed, the sun rising and setting. I found nothing. Just when I was about to give up, I stumbled upon a website. Forum for people who had encountered strange and unexplained phenomena. I created an account, posted my story. Within minutes I had responses. People from all over the country sharing their own experiences with similar creatures. They called it the Faceless One, the Skinless Man, Eater of Souls. They said it was ancient, a being that had existed for centuries, feeding on the fear and flesh of humans. They said it was unstoppable. I refused to believe that. There had to be a way to defeat it. I spent the next few days reading through the forum, learning everything I could about it. Seemed to be drawn to places of darkness and despair. Abandoned buildings, isolated stretches of wilderness, places where people felt lost and alone. It fed on negative emotion, fear, anger, sadness. The more you feared it, stronger it became. I realized then, my only hope was to confront my fear, face the creature head-on without giving in to the terror it inspired. Packed my bags, grabbed a hunting rifle and a silver crucifix I'd found in my attic. I didn't know if it would do any good, but it was worth a try. I drove back up north towards Lake Superior. The sky was overcast, air heavy with the smell of rain. I parked the truck near the same spot where I'd encountered the creature. Memory of that day sending shivers down my spine. I took a deep breath, stepped out of the truck. The woods were silent, only sound the wind rustling through the leaves. I followed the same trail I'd taken before towards the clearing, where I'd found the deer carcass. Clearing was empty now. Carcass gone, but the stench of death still lingered in the air. I stood there waiting. The shadows seemed to lengthen, the air growing colder. Then I heard it, a hiss coming from the depth of the forest. Creature was back, and it was coming for me. The hissing grew louder, closer. I raised the rifle, my finger tightening on the trigger. Crucifix felt cold against my chest. Shadow emerged from the trees, a shapeless mass of darkness. It moved towards me, its form shifting and undulating like smoke in the wind. I fired. The bullet passed through the creature, leaving no mark. It continued to advance, its hissing turning into a low growl. I fired again and again, each shot passing through the creature as if it were made of air. Panic clawed at my throat. I dropped the rifle, reached for the crucifix, held it out in front of me, a shield against the darkness. The creature stopped, its formless body pulsating. It seemed to recoil from the crucifix, its growls turning into whimpers. It took a step forward, then another. The creature backed away, its form shrinking, fading. I kept moving, crucifix held high. Creature retreated further until it was nothing more than a faint shadow at the edge of the clearing. Then it vanished. I stood there panting, crucifix still clutched in my hand. The silence was deafening. Had I defeated it, or had it simply retreated, biding its time? I didn't know, but I knew one thing. I wouldn't give up. I would keep fighting, Keep searching for a way to destroy the creature once and for all. I returned to the diner, told Darla what had happened. She listened, her eyes wide with disbelief. "You drove it away?" she asked. I nodded, holding up the crucifix. "With this," I said. She looked at it, then back at me. "Maybe there's hope after all," she said, faint smile playing on her lips. I stayed in town for a few more days, searching the woods for any sign of the creature. I found nothing. It was as if it had vanished into thin air. I returned home a changed man. I still had nightmares. Still saw the creature's faceless visage in my mind's eye. I was no longer afraid. I knew that I had the power to fight back. I continued to research the creature, scouring the internet for any information I could find. I learned that it was not a solitary being, part of a larger entity. Collective consciousness of darkness, fed on human suffering. I also learned that there were others like me, people who had encountered the creature and survived. People who were determined to stop it. We formed a group, a network of survivors who shared information and resources. We called ourselves the Guardians. We learned that the creature was vulnerable to certain things: light, faith, hope, and silver. We started carrying silver bullets, silver crosses, silver blades. We armed ourselves with knowledge and determination. We knew that the fight would be long and difficult. We were ready. We were the Guardians, and we would not rest until the darkness was vanquished. Years passed. The Guardians grew in number, our network expanding across the globe. We fought the creature wherever it appeared, driving it back into the shadows. We saved countless lives, brought hope to those who had lost it. Slowly but surely, we began to turn the tide. The creature's appearances became less frequent, its power waning. It seemed that our efforts were paying off, but we knew that the battle was far from over. The creature was still out there, lurking in the darkness, waiting for its chance to strike it. And we would be waiting. As for the creature's name, I never learned it, but I came to think of it as the Null, a void of emptiness that sought to consume all that was good and beautiful in the world. November 1997. Lost the damn dog again. Took the mutt Barnaby with me on a fishing trip up north, Lake Superior. Figured the fresh air would do him good, him and his endless shedding. Parked the truck near a deserted stretch of shoreline, rocky cliffs overlooking the steely water. Barnaby bolted out, tail wagging, sniffing every damn pebble. I set up my rod, cast my line. Silence except for the waves lapping against the shore. Barnaby was nowhere in sight. "Barnaby!" I yelled, my voice echoing across the lake. No response. Great, just great. Left my gear on the shore and started searching for the damn dog. Followed a trail through the woods, thick with pines and birch trees. Found a clearing, sunlight filtering through the leaves, and then I saw it. A deer carcass, freshly killed. Its body was torn open, entrails spilling out like spilled spaghetti. Barnaby stood a few feet away, whimpering, his fur bristling. "Jesus, Barnaby," I muttered, covering my nose against the stench. "What did you find?" He whimpered again, backing away, his tail tucked between his legs. Something rustled in the bushes. I turned, my heart pounding. There it was, a figure tall and gaunt, emerging from the shadows, skin pale and clammy like a corpse left out in the rain. It wore tattered clothes, limbs long and spindly. Its face, No, it didn't have a face, just a smooth expanse of skin, featureless except for a gaping maw filled with rows of needle-like teeth. It let out a hiss, a sound like air escaping a punctured tire. "Barnaby," I yelled, cowering behind me. I backed away, my mind racing. What the hell was this thing? It took a step towards us, its movements jerky and unnatural. Could smell its breath. Foul stench of decay and something else. Something metallic like blood. Barnaby whined again, his body trembling. I knew we had to get out of there. Turned and ran. Barnaby at my heel. We crashed through the undergrowth, creatures' hisses echoing behind us. Reached the shore, scrambled over the rocks towards the truck, fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking. Creature emerged from the trees, pale form silhouetted against the setting sun. It let out a shriek, a sound that seemed to pierce my eardrum. I threw open the truck door, shoved Barnaby inside, jumped into the driver's seat, and slammed the door shut, turned the key. Engine sputtered to life. Creature lunged, claws scraping against the truck's window. I threw the truck into gear, tires spinning as we sped away. Didn't stop until we reached the nearest town. A dusty little outpost with a single gas station and a diner that smelled of stale coffee and grease. Barnaby whined in the back seat, his body still trembling. Got out, my legs shaky, and went inside the diner. Ordered a double shot of whiskey, downed it in one gulp. Waitress, a woman with tired eyes and a name tag that read Darla, gave me a curious look. "Rough day?" he asked. Fired my gun, port shattering the silence of the forest. Figure staggered back, clutching its chest. I fired again and again, emptying the chamber. The figure collapsed to the ground, its body twitching and convulsing. I approached cautiously, my gun still raised. The figure lay motionless on the ground, its eyes staring blankly at the sky. I knelt down, my heart still racing, and reached out to touch its skin. It was cold and clammy, dead fish. I stood up, my legs shaking, looked around. Forest was silent. Only sound the wind whistling through the trees. I had killed it. Whatever it was. In the days that followed, I tried to make sense of what I had seen. I contacted the park service, but they were skeptical of my story. They said there had been no reports of strange creatures in the park. No missing hikers, no unexplained animal death. They suggested I was suffering from stress from the loss of my wife. I knew they were wrong. I had seen it with my own eyes. I had felt its cold, clammy skin beneath my fingers. I knew I wasn't crazy. I returned to the spot where I had killed the creature, hoping to find some evidence, some proof that I wasn't imagining things. But there was nothing. The body was gone, vanished without a trace. I searched the forest, scouring every inch of ground, every tree, every rock, but I found nothing. It was as if the creature had never existed. I started to doubt myself, to wonder if I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe the park service was right, maybe I was losing my mind. But then, one night, I was sitting in my cabin, reading a book by the fire, when I heard a noise outside, a scratching sound at the door. I put down my book and listened. The scratching continued, growing louder and more insistent. I got up and went to the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I reached for the doorknob, my hand trembling. I took a deep breath and opened the door. Standing on the porch was the creature. It was even taller than I remembered, its long arms reaching almost to the roof of the cabin. Its head was even more misshapen, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. I screamed and slammed the door shut, fumbling for the lock. I heard the creature pounding on the door, its growls echoing through the cabin. I grabbed my gun and backed away, my eyes fixed on the door. The pounding continued, relentless and deafening. I knew the door wouldn't hold for long. I had to get out of it. I ran to the back of the cabin, grabbed my backpack, and climbed out the window. I sprinted into the forest, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear the creature behind me, its growls growing louder and closer. I ran and ran, stumbling over rocks and fallen logs. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to get away. I finally reached a clearing, my lungs burning, my legs aching. I collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. I looked back. There was no sign of the creature. I lay there for a long time, listening to the sounds of the forest. I didn't know what to do, where to go. I was alone, lost, terrified. In the end, they believed me. They had to. After finding the ravaged campsite, the hiker's remains scattered like a macabre jigsaw puzzle. His name was Tyler, a young kid eager to see the world. He'd seen too much of it too soon. But even with the evidence, the truth was too monstrous to swallow whole. They called it a bear attack. Rogue grizzly gone mad. Easier to blame a beast we know than the one we don't. The park closed indefinitely. Some whisper about reopening it, but the fear lingers. It's in the shadows that lengthen as the sun sets, in the wind that whispers through the pine. Me, I'm back in Ohio, surrounded by the familiar, but I see it in my dream. Creature, eyes burning, claws reaching. I know it's still out there, somewhere in the vast wilderness, waiting, watching. I've read up on it, the myths and legends of wild men, creatures that walk the line between man and beast. Some say they're protectors of the wild, others say they're demons in disguise. But I know what I saw, and I know it wasn't human. They say it was driven by hunger, by a primal need to feed. But I saw something else in its eye. Something cold and calculating. Wasn't just hungry. Was malicious. Wanted to hurt, kill. They say it was a one-time thing. Freak occurrence. But I know better. Still out there. Somewhere in the dark corners of the world, and it's waiting for its next victim. This happened to me in 2008, the summer I lost my wife Mary to cancer. Not to the big C itself, but to the chemo cocktail that was supposed to save her. It left me hollowed out like a dead tree still standing. Figured a season in Glacier National Park might do me some good. Fresh air, hard work, no pitying looks from neighbors back in Ohio. EMT Yoder's the name. Been a park ranger for 15 years, most of them spent in Yellowstone. But the tourists, the damn crowds, they were too much like the hospital waiting rooms, full of forced cheer and the smell of disinfectant. Glacier was different. Solitude, peace that scraped the sky, grizzly bears that reminded you nature ain't no petting zoo. The job was simple enough. Patrol the backcountry trails, keep an eye on the wildlife, make sure the granola-crunching hikers didn't do anything stupid. It was peaceful. Kind of peace that lets a man think, breathe, maybe even heal a little. The first couple of weeks were quiet. Just the usual stuff. A moose calf tangled in fishing line, a couple of college kids trying to summit a peak in flip-flops. But then things started to get strange. I'd find animal carcasses, half-eaten, with wounds that didn't look like any predator I knew. Tracks that were almost human, but not quite. I chalked it up to bears at first, grizzlies or messy eaters. But the more I saw, the less it added up. One evening, I was hiking back to my cabin after a long day on the trail. The sun was dipping behind the mountains, casting long shadows that danced and twisted in the fading light. I heard a noise, a low growl that seemed to come from the trees. I stopped, listening, my hand instinctively reaching for the radio on my belt. The growl came again, closer this time. I drew my sidearm, .44 Magnum, hoping I wouldn't have to use it. I scanned the trees, searching for the source of the sound, but there was nothing, just the wind rustling through the leaves. I continued on, my senses on high alert. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck prickling, old sweat breaking out on my skin. I knew I wasn't alone. As I rounded a bend in the trail, I saw it. Figure standing in the middle of the path, silhouetted against the setting sun. It was tall and thin, with long arms that hung almost to the ground. Its head was large and misshapen, with a pointed snout and eyes that glowed in the darkness. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Figure didn't move, just stood there, watching me. I raised my gun, my finger tightening on the trigger. "Identify yourself," I shouted, my voice echoing through the trees. Figure didn't respond, just stood there, eyes fixed on me. I took a step forward, my gun still trained on the figure. "Identify yourself," I repeated, my voice louder this time. The figure